Hello guys, welcome to Sleepymentary. Tonight we are going to stand on the edge of a world made almost entirely of silence. Not the silence of a quiet room, but the heavy hush of a horizon that is nothing but ice. Imagine the sun dimmed to a pale coin behind a frosted lens, the air so cold it seems to steal a little piece of your warmth with every breath. The sea you know is gone, the forests you love are gone. Clouds hang like thin veils over a sky that never quite becomes blue. The light is diffuse, a soft white poured over everything, and your footprints squeak on snow so dry it sounds like glass dust. Stay here a moment. Feel how this landscape presses on your chest and slows your thinking. The cold has a way of shrinking time, of making every movement precious. Yet in this impossible world, the Earth is not dead. It is more alive than we usually notice. Life has always adjusted to the planet's moods, and the planet's moods are grand, hot, cold, wet, dry, each a chapter with its own voice. Tonight we will read the quietest of those chapters, the ones written in ice. We were taught to think of ice ages as long winters. That is like calling an ocean a puddle. Ice ages are not seasons. They are resets, deep system reboots, pages crumpled and smoothed again, landscapes erased and redrawn as if the planet were practicing the art of forgetting and remembering. If you listen closely, the ice is whispering. It does not shout, it stores, it keeps, it layers tiny memories into itself, a grain at a time, a winter at a time, until whole continents carry a library on their backs. The story we're going to tell isn't just the familiar one with mammoths and hunters, though we will meet them. It stretches much farther and dives much deeper to ages when there were no tree, no flowers, not even fish with bones. When the sun was weaker, the days shorter, and the first breaths of oxygen felt like a crisis instead of a gift. The ice remembers that too. And if we learn to read what it remembers, some of the things we think we know about the history of life and about ourselves start to shift. Take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these journeys into history. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your corner of the world? I'd love to know. We will move slowly the way snow falls. We'll cross deserts that used to be tropical seaways. We'll walk over bedrock that was ground flat under glaciers a mile thick. We'll hold a stone that once lay beneath warm shallow waves, and just centimeters above it find a rock that formed under brutal cold. That sudden switch, warm to frozen blue to white, will raise the first question that matters. How quickly can a world change? Faster than our minds like to believe. Sometimes fast enough that myths and memories collide, fast enough that animals and people are caught between two climates like a door in mid-swing. Take the rock in your hand, the one that seems mute and grey. Close your fingers and feel how the cold climbs into your skin. Inside that rock are shapes with names you've never had to learn, tiny crystals that grow only when water freezes in a certain way. Grains that carry scratches long and parallel left by ice as it dragged them along the ground. Pebbles that fell off the underside of a glacier into the sea, raining from ice like stone hail. They are small signatures, but together they sign a document that says unequivocally there was ice here. Not frost in the grass, not a winter in the hills, ice ancient and heavy, slow as continents, powerful enough to move mountains. In some places that document appears where no ice should have lived. Tropical latitudes forcing us to reconsider not only the strength of the cold, but its reach. If the ice can advance that far, what else can it do? It can make rivers run backward. It can invent new valleys and crush old ones. It can grind a city to powder and quietly file it under miscellaneous sediment. This is why in certain late-night corners of the imagination, people wonder if entire stories, cultures, experiments, lifetimes might have been written and then erased, leaving only those in stone and dreamlike echoes in old myths. We will not chase conspiracies here, but we will honor serious mysteries. In a world that has frozen and thawed many times, there is room for the possibility that some chapters are missing, not because they never existed, but because ice is both a keeper and a thief. Before we descend into the deep past, breathe. Notice how your lungs work harder in the cold, how the edges of your world grow sharper as your body tries to hold its heat. This is how our ancestors felt at the mouth of a cave or the skin door of a snow shelter testing the air. The cold trains attention. It makes you notice patterns, winds that rise at sunset frost, that blooms in certain hollows, trails that hold firm beneath your boots and others that swallow them. Survival in any ice age. Prehistoric or imagined begins with noticing. Science is noticing too repeated with better tools. Our instruments are modern, our question ancient. What happened here? How did it happen? How fast, and what does that speed do to living things? You won't need to memorize names or dates. Let the rhythm carry you. Think of the planet like a breathing body. Glaciations are its slow inhales, interglacials its slow exhales. The breath is governed by many muscles changes in the Earth's orbit. The tilt of its axis, the geography of continents, the chemical blend of the air. None of them acts alone. When enough of them pull in the same direction, ice grows. When they release, ice falls back. It sounds tidy when I say it like that. It wasn't. The planet has never moved like a metronome. It lurches, hesitates, surges, stalls. Its breath can catch in the throat for 1,000 years, and yet out on the ice the day-to-day is gentle. Snow falls, the surface settles. Dormibtun's faint winds carve scallops into hard drifts, and each new layer committeates those beneath it into a memory you can drill and read like lines of a diary. We'll come to that diary soon enough. For now, keep looking at the horizon. Feel its flatness. There is a hum you only hear on cold nights when the world is stripped to its essential sounds. A low wind combing across open ground. The tiny crackle of your own muscles adjusting beneath a heavy coat, the distant pop of ice shifting somewhere you cannot see. In their quiet big thoughts arrive uninvited. What is strength, rigid endurance, or the flexibility to bend? What does survival look like when the rules change faster than you can? We tell ourselves that history is a line that leads to us. Ice reminds us that history is a series of loops, advance, retreat, flourish, fall, remember, forget. And because loops can repeat, tonight's journey isn't just backward into the deep cold, it is forward too into a future that might not be as warm and still as the one you feel through your blanket right now. That future is not a threat. It's a teacher waiting with chalk in hand, tapping the blackboard softly until we look up. I want you to feel safe as we travel. Dim the lights. Let your shoulders drop a centimetre, then another. If you like, turn on a fan just low enough to make a constant hush your private polar wind. We are not rushing. Ice ages do not reward haste. We will sit with each place long enough to hear what it has to say. Some of the answers will be ordinary and beautiful frost flowers blooming on young sea ice. The way caribou select a path over crusted snow, how soot from distant fires darkens a glacier's surface and speeds its melt. Others will be startling, even unsettling times when the earth may have been almost completely sheathed in white. Times when sudden warmings shattered ice in an afternoon and sent lakes pouring over whole valleys. Moments when life teetered, then reinvented itself. It is tempting to think the cold makes the world simple white and blue, quiet and still. It does not. The cold reveals details you miss in noisy seasons, the shape of the wind, the structure of crystals, the exact sound of a raven's wing. That attentiveness will help us tonight. We're going to listen for small things that hint at large truths, a scratch on a stone, a bubble in a frozen layer, a seam of sand where no beach should be. Each is a thread. Tug enough threads and a tapestry appears. You may feel a little awe rising, the good kind that loosens the chest. That's the point. Awe slows the mind and opens the door. When we pass through, we'll find ourselves in places where the air had almost no oxygen, where the oceans wore a roof of ice, where heat from inside the earth carved blue caverns beneath white domes. We'll watch the planet freeze so completely it gleams like a mirror, then watch volcanoes write their way back into the sky until the mirror cracks and water hammers down the slopes in torrents that reorder the map. We will meet creatures built for this: long hair, short ears, fat under fur, patience under pressure, and we will meet people who turned bones into houses and scarcity into ceremony. You are not here to memorize the names of epochs in the dark. You are here to feel the scale of time in your body, to hold the idea that a world can change so much and still be home. You're here to let the quiet carry you until sleep comes and brings its own soft weather. When you wake, the room will still be warm, the fan still humming the horizon back where it belongs. But some part of you will remember this white stillness, the way the planet speaks when it is wrapped in its winter skin. Tonight is the beginning. We will walk into the cold together and come back with pockets full of meaning. The ice keeps its secrets, but it does not keep them from those who learn how to listen. Stay close. Breathe evenly. Let your eyes close if they want to. The snow is falling, the story is beginning, and there is so much to find under the silence. When you pick up a stone, it feels silent, closed, a thing that says nothing. But look closer and you begin to see it is a page pressed in secrets written not with ink, but with pressure, with scratches, with faint crystals that tell of water frozen long before any human eyes existed. The Earth writes its autobiography not in letters, but in layers, and nowhere is that autobiography more compelling, more stubbornly preserved than in ice. Ice is not only a destroyer, it is also a librarian. It erases some chapters, yes, grinding valleys into dust, crushing forests into silt. But it also saves things, saves them with a precision that no parchment or archive can rival. Imagine holding a core of ice drilled from the heart of Antarctica. It looks like nothing more than a cylinder of white-blue glass, but inside it is a time machine. Thin bands mark the passage of seasons the way rings mark a tree's age. Between them lie secrets of centuries, tiny bubbles of air, sealed pockets of ancient atmosphere. You can hold your hand against the ice and in a sense touch the breath of someone who lived 100,000 years ago. In those bubbles, scientists measure the levels of carbon dioxide, methane and other gases, reconstructing the climate of times when mammoths still roamed, or when continents wore glaciers like crowns. It is as if the planet itself kept a diary and the entries are written in frost. But ice doesn't just whisper in bubbles. Rocks tell their stories too, especially the ones shaped by glaciers. Geologists know to look for tillites, rocks made of debris carried by moving ice. They recognize pebbles with strange parallel scratches, striations carved as glaciers dragged them across bedrock. They find massive erratics boulders stranded far from their source, dropped like punctuation marks when the ice that carried them melted away. These are not random accidents. They are words in a story about where the ice has been and how far it reached. Sometimes the story surprises us. Imagine finding glacial deposits in what is now the heart of the tropics. Places that today drip with humidity and green were once scraped raw by ice a kilometre thick. Fossils of warm water creatures suddenly vanish in layers of stone replaced by traces of freezing seas. It is as if the earth turned the page too quickly, leaping from a chapter of lush abundance into one of silence and snow. These contradictions force us to rewrite what we thought we knew. And then there are the isotopes, those subtle fingerprints left by oxygen atoms in water molecules. Ice cores contain ratios of oxygen 16 and oxygen 18 that reveal temperature shifts with astonishing precision. A small change in the ratio tells us whether the world was warming or cooling, whether glaciers advanced or withdrew. Like delicate handwriting in a margin, these isotopic signatures fill in details, a sudden century-long cold snapper, gradual climb toward warmth, the heartbeat of the planet stretched across millennia. What makes this remarkable is not only the patience of ice, but its honesty. Human archives exaggerate, mythologize, forget. Ice simply records. It remembers every storm that blew dust from the Sahara, every volcanic eruption that blackened the sky, every wildfire that sent soot high into the air. Tiny specks of ash and pollen are frozen inside the cores, waiting for microscopes to rediscover them. In some layers, the fallout of ancient eruptions can be traced, linking climate chaos in one hemisphere to crop failures and migrations in another. To think of ice and stone as books is not mere poetry, it is science. Each layer is a sentence, each crystal a syllable. Together they compose a narrative that no historian could invent because it stretches back far beyond memory. To read it requires drills, microscopes, chemical analysis, and an imagination humble enough to hear whispers instead of shouts. So when we say the ice is a keeper of secrets, we mean it literally. It has kept the sigh of mammoths, the soot of ancient fires, the thin breath of an atmosphere before agriculture or cities, and it has kept the contradictions, the warm seas that turned cold in a geological instant, the deserts that suddenly received snow, the plants that died, and the algae that bloomed. All of it filed away patiently like a librarian waiting for us to finally learn how to read. And here is the most humbling part: what we know so far is only a fraction. For every core drilled, for every fossil found, there are millions more hidden beneath kilometers of ice or buried under mountains. The shelves of this library stretch further than we can yet explore. Each discovery is not the last chapter, only a bookmark that tells us where we left off. So hold the thought as you drift deeper into tonight's journey. The ground beneath you is not mute, the glaciers not empty. They are full of memory, full of voices pressed into silence. And if we learn to listen, they will tell us things about our past and our future that we cannot afford to ignore. If you asked in school, you probably learned that Earth has had a few ice ages. A neat tidy list, one in the deep past, another around the time of the dinosaurs' successors, and the most recent one that our own ancestors survived. It sounds organized, almost manageable, as if we could pin them like specimens on a board. But the truth is far less simple and far more unsettling. The record is incomplete, torn, rewritten, and sometimes contradictory. To ask how many ice ages there have been is to walk into a hall of broken mirrors where each reflection shows a different piece of the truth. Geology is our guide here, but geology is not a perfect historian. The Earth is restless. It recycles its crust, pushes up new mountains, drowns old lands beneath oceans, buries whole landscapes under lava. The result is that evidence of ancient freezes is often erased, scrambled, or scattered, like fragments of a lost manuscript. What we have are torn pages, a deposit of tillite here, a scratched boulder there, a chemical signature frozen into isotopes somewhere else. Put them together and you get the outline of a story, but never the full story. And sometimes those fragments tell us things that seem impossible. One of the strangest puzzles comes from places where layers of warm water limestone rock that can only form in tropical seas lie directly on top of glacial deposits. Imagine that fossils of corals and algae that lived in sunlit, balmy waters, sitting right above rocks gouged and dropped by moving ice. It is as if the world flipped a switch from paradise to prison and back again in the blink of a geological eye. How could seas once teeming with life be frozen solid so quickly, only to thaw and return to warmth? That contradiction has forced scientists to admit that climate can swing violently and far faster than we used to believe. The official count of ice ages varies depending on who you ask. Some textbooks say 4 or 5 major ones. Others argue for 6. But those are just the big headline events, the ones that left scars large enough to see clearly today. Between them lie dozens of smaller glaciations, brief cold snaps, regional freezes that may not have covered the whole globe, but left their fingerprints on continents, oceans, and living things. If we count all of those, the number multiplies. And still, even that might not be enough, because new discoveries keep nudging the timeline further back. Take the Uronian glaciation, for example, the one long believed to be the first about 2.3 billion years ago. For decades, it stood as the grand opening of Earth's frozen history. But recent findings hint at something earlier, something even more mysterious, possible traces of ice before oxygen filled the air, before life had the tools we recognize today. If those hints are true, it means our planet knew deep cold long before it had forests, flowers, or even a stable sky. It means ice ages are not rare disasters. They are woven into the planet's DNA. Why does this matter? Because every time we discover another frozen chapter, we have to rethink the story of life. Ice is not just a backdrop, it is a protagonist. Each freeze and thaw cycle has erased, rewritten, and accelerated evolution in ways we are only beginning to grasp. A shallow sea may host warm water microbes one millennium, then lie under a glacier the next, then burst into life again after the thaw. For those organisms, the cycle is not curiosity, it is life or death. So how many ice ages have there been? The honest answer is more than we thought, fewer than we will one day discover, and never as simple as the charts suggest. The count is changing, always changing, because every new drill, every new rock layer, every isotope analysis reveals another whisper of cold. And with each whisper comes a reminder. Earth is not stable. It is not predictable. It is not inclined to keep the climate steady for our convenience. Perhaps that is why the image of warm water rocks over glacial stone is so powerful. It shows us that opposites are not centuries apart, but sometimes pressed together, page on page, warmth and cold jostling in the same paragraph of Earth's book. The planet does not move neatly from chapter to chapter. It scribbles, erases, overwrites, and sometimes leaps across genres. To study the ice ages is to accept that the book is incomplete and always will be. But even fragments are enough to teach us that the world we live in now, with its balance of seasons and its fragile warmth, is not permanent. It is an interlude, a pause between pages, and the page is already turning. More than 2 billion years ago, the Earth slipped into a winter so long and so deep that it almost remade the definition of time itself. Geologists call it the Uronian glaciation, named after the rocks in Ontario, Canada, where its first traces were found. But the name hardly captures its scale. This was not a season or even a span of centuries, it was a reign of ice that lasted hundreds of millions of years. Generations upon generations, had there been people to live them, would have been born and buried without ever seeing a thaw. The evidence comes to us in the form of tillites rocks made from sediments dumped and compacted beneath glaciers. You can picture it, ice sheets the size of continents grinding across the land. picking up sandstones and boulders and dragging them along for hundreds of miles before finally dropping them in heaps when the ice melted just enough to release its cargo. Today those deposits are frozen into stone found not only in Canada, but also in South Africa, India and beyond. The wide distribution tells us this was no local freeze, it was a planetary event. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that world. The continents were arranged differently, the sun shone weaker than it does today, and the air was only beginning to carry significant amounts of oxygen. There were no trees, no flowers, no animals, the landscape was bare rock and shallow seas. Overhead the sky might have glowed a strange rusty hue coloured by chemical reactions alien to our own atmosphere. And then came the ice. Vast sheets creeping outward from the poles, blanketing valleys and coastlines, sealing oceans beneath crusts of white. The silence would have been absolute. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, no footstep of mammoth or man. Only the groan of glaciers cracking and shifting, the whisper of snow falling onto more snow. Now imagine, for the sake of perspective, that humans had existed then. We would have built our shelters not of wood or bone, but from stone piled against the wind. Our fires would have struggled for oxygen in the thin, strange air. Our breath would have frosted instantly, filling caves with ghosts of vapour. Hunting would have been impossible, there were no herds to chase, no flocks to trap. We would have lived as scavengers of ice, perhaps drinking meltwater from cracks and glaciers, scraping minerals from rocks, gathering heat where volcanic vents broke through the frozen surface. Life would have been not just survival, but defiance. Of course, humans were not there. Instead, the planet's inhabitants were microscopic cyanobacteria painting shallow, seas with faint green microbes clinging to hydrothermal vents. But even they were tested. For them, the ice was both threat and shield. The cold locked away liquid water strangling the surface world. Yet beneath the glaciers and cracks of the seabed, tiny oases remained. Here, protected from the killing cold, bacteria continued their slow work of breathing, feeding, multiplying. It was these survivors who would eventually shape the world to come. What strikes us most about the Uronian is its duration. Hundreds of millions of years of winter. It is almost impossible to grasp. Think of our own lifespans or the span of recorded history. Even the rise and fall of empires would be nothing against such a stretch of time. If we lived, then history itself would feel like a glacier, immovable, unchanging, heavy as the sky. Every sunrise would look like the last. Every horizon would be the same bleak white. Hope itself would be hard to imagine because change would come too slowly for any living being to witness. And yet change was happening invisibly, relentlessly. The very ice that seemed eternal was recording the story of its own undoing. Beneath the frozen surface, volcanoes continued to belch carbon dioxide. With no forest to draw it back down, the gas accumulated in the atmosphere molecule by molecule. Slowly the greenhouse blanket thickened. The cold tightened its grip for millions of years, but it could not hold forever. Eventually the balance tipped, the planet warmed, and the first great winter ended in a cataclysm of melting flooding and renewal. The Uronian left behind scars in the rocks and a lesson in humility. Earth has frozen before life had any chance to flourish, and it may do so again. For us, the fascination lies not only in the science, but in the strangeness, imagining what it would mean to walk a landscape without trees or grass, to breathe air without birds above it, to live in a silence broken only by the moan of glaciers grinding continents into dust. The Uronian is not just an ancient event. It is a reminder that our warm green world is a fragile exception, a pause between winters. The first great winter still whispers from the stones, patience, resilience, inevitability. If we could hear it clearly, it would tell us that ice has always been part of Earth's story and always will be. The Uronian winter did not happen in isolation. It was born from a transformation so radical, it altered the chemistry of the air itself. Geologists call it the Great Oxidation Event, but that sterile phrase hides a drama both violent and miraculous. Imagine a planet where the sky carried almost no oxygen, where every breath would suffocate us instantly. That was Earth before cyano. Bacteria, tiny architects of destiny, began their quiet revolution. In shallow seas, they spread in vast mats, photosynthesizing as plants do today. With every flicker of sunlight, they pulled in carbon dioxide and released oxygen as waste. Waste for that is what it was then, an unwanted byproduct. To us, oxygen is the breath of life. To the organisms of that world, it was a poison. For countless anaerobes microbes that had thrived in the oxygen-free soup since the dawn of time, this new gas was lethal. They withered, suffocated, and disappeared into extinction. What we call a revolution was for them a massacre. But oxygen was not only a killer, it was also the raw material for change. It allowed new metabolisms to evolve metabolisms that could extract far more energy from food. It set the stage for complexity for cells with nuclei for multicellular life for us. In this sense, oxygen was a paradox, the destroyer of one world and the midwife of another, a killer and a saviour arriving in the same breath. The tragedy of the anaerobes was only the first act. Oxygen reacted with methane, the powerful greenhouse gas that once blanketed the Earth. Methane molecules, once plentiful, broke down in oxygen's presence, leaving behind weaker carbon dioxide and water vapour. The planet's insulation thinned. Heat leaked into space, temperatures fell, oceans began to freeze. The great oxidation event, for all its promise, plunged Earth into the Uronian glaciation, a cold so deep it nearly erased life itself. Think of it, a microscopic creature invisible to the naked eye, altering the fate of a planet. It is both humbling and alarming, because if microbes could tip the balance, then what are we capable of now? We too are changing the atmosphere, only not by accident, but knowingly. Our engines and factories release gases at a speed unmatched in Earth's history. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, all rising. Where cyanobacteria pulled methane down and cooled the world, we are pushing greenhouse gases up and warming it. The scale is different, but the principle is the same: small molecules drifting in air strong enough to flip the climate into another state. Oxygen reminds us that change can be double-edged. It gives life, and it takes life away. It can transform deserts into gardens or plunge seas into silence. It is not a gentle element. It burns, it corrodes, it oxidizes. Without it, fire does not exist, but with too much fire, devours everything. In its arrival, we see a mirror of our present dilemma. Every climate tipping point carries that same paradox, promise and peril intertwined. Close your eyes and picture that ancient Earth. Shallow seas, glowing faintly green mats of bacteria bubbling oxygen into the air. The sky slowly shifting from hazy orange to the deepening blue we know today. Beneath the surface, whole kingdoms of life gasping their last while new ones stir into possibility. The silence of glaciers advancing, the hiss of methane burning away, the quiet birth of a future. The great oxidation event is a reminder that our atmosphere is not fixed, not guaranteed. It is a living thing vulnerable to change. Once it was altered by microbes too small to see, now it is altered by us creatures with cities, machines and choices. The question is the same as it was 2 billion years ago. Will the new air be a killer or a saviour? The answer will depend, as it always has, on how life adapts. Once oxygen had stripped the atmosphere of methane, the planet began to shiver. Temperatures fell, ice spread from the poles, and what might have started as a thin white fringe quickly became a runaway process. This is the cruel elegance of the albedo effect. The brighter Earth becomes, the more sunlight it reflects back into space, and the colder it grows. A patch of ice on a mountain invites more snow, which reflects more light, which lowers the temperature further until the patch becomes a sheet and the sheet becomes an empire. Now imagine this process not over years, but over millennia. Coastlines freeze, oceans stiffen at their edges, snow falls where rain once poured. Forests, if any had existed, then would have vanished beneath ice crusts. With every degree of cooling, the planet tilted further toward a point of no return. What began as a world dotted with glaciers became a planet almost entirely encased in white. From space, Earth would have been unrecognizable. Not the blue and green jewel we know, but a blinding sphere, white and crystalline, gleaming, like a marble of quartz suspended in the black. Sunlight struck its surface and ricocheted away, leaving little warmth behind. Clouds drifted in pale sheets indistinguishable from the ground beneath them. Even the equator, where heat usually reigns, lay frozen beneath kilometers of ice. It was as though the planet had been dipped in frost and set out to harden in the void. Beneath this frozen skin, silence reigned. The seas lay locked under thick lids, their surfaces hard and still. But deep below, where sunlight had never reached anyway, water remained liquid. Hydrothermal vents continued to exhale their mineral-rich breath into the darkness, supporting tiny ecosystems that clung to survival. If there was a pulse of life left on the planet, it beat faintly in those hidden pockets, waiting for the future. The image is stark Earth as a snowball rolling silently through space, cold and bright, fragile and yet enduring. And in that stillness, something extraordinary was happening. The planet had not died. It was simply holding its breath. Beneath the ice, chemistry continued. Volcanoes still roared in secret, sending plumes of gas upward, unable to pierce the frozen ceiling. Deep currents still stirred, and above it all the sun, weaker then than it is now, continued to shine faintly, painting the white marble in silver light. It is hard for us to imagine because we measure cold in winters in blizzards that last a day, a week, perhaps a season. But this was not a season. This was an epoch of ice. Millions of years would pass before the world warmed again. If you could stand on that frozen earth and look around, you might feel as though nothing would ever change. But change was already working invisibly and patiently in the gases collecting in the sky and the fire rumbling beneath the crust. For now, though, picture it clearly: a planet completely remade by feedback loops, a victim of its own brightness. A white globe, dazzling and cold, turning in the dark. This was not the Earth we know, but it was our Earth nonetheless. And its story, frozen, silent, shimmering, is still written in the rocks beneath our feet. On the surface, Earth had become a grave. The oceans lay trapped beneath a thick, frozen lid. Sunlight bounced away into space, and the continents were buried under sheets of ice that stretched from horizon to horizon. From above, the planet looked dead, a silent white marble drifting through the void. But life is stubborn. It does not surrender easily. And while the surface froze into stillness in the dark waters below, life found places to hide. Picture the seafloor during this planetary winter. Black vents gush hot mineral-rich fluids into the abyss, creating shimmering towers of chemical energy. Around these hydrothermal oases, microbial communities thrived, blind but alive. They did not need sunlight. Instead, they harvested energy from the earth itself, sulfur, iron, methane minerals rising from the mantle. In the crushing dark far below the ice, they continued their ancient work of eating, dividing and persisting. These microbes were not fragile victims of circumstance. They were innovators. Some evolved protective coatings to survive the cold. Others slowed their metabolisms to near dormancy, waiting out centuries of darkness. Tiny algae may have clung to thin pockets of liquid water beneath the ice, glowing faintly green in hidden cracks. The planet was frozen, but life stitched itself into the margins, refusing to let go. We know this not just from theory, but from their descendants. Even today, extremophiles flourish in the most hostile corners of Earth. In Antarctica, beneath kilometers of ice, entire lakes remain liquid, sealed off for millions of years, hosting bacterial colonies that metabolize slowly but steadily. In the deep oceans around modern hydrothermal vents, we find tube worms, clams, and bizarre microbes that thrive at temperatures and pressures lethal to most other life. These organisms are living echoes of the survivors of Snowball Earth. They remind us that resilience is written into the code of life, and this resilience stretches our imagination outward toward other worlds. If microbes could survive on a frozen Earth sheltered under ice and warmed by vents, why not elsewhere? Europa, the icy moon of Jupiter, hides an ocean beneath its shell. Enceladus, moon of Saturn, sprays plumes of salty water into space from cracks in its icy crust. Both could be versions of what Earth once was, a frozen sphere with warmth and chemistry hidden below. If life could endure here during the Snowball Earth, might it also stir in those distant seas? The thought is humbling. What looked like extinction from afar was up-close adaptation. What seemed like silence was in truth a whispered persistence. Life may not have been visible, but it endured patient, invisible, and resourceful. In every Snowball Earth, the lesson repeats: survival does not always mean triumph. Sometimes it simply means finding the narrow cracks, the hidden warmth, the slow path through darkness until the world changes again. So the planet wrapped in white was not truly dead. It was waiting. Beneath the ice, microbes clung to vents, to fissures, to any pocket where water and heat remained. They were the torchbearers holding life's flame through the long night. Without them, there would be no us, no forests, no civilizations. They kept the story alive when all else seemed erased. And as we imagine their persistence, we glimpse a truth. Life is not fragile, not really. It is adaptable. It survives in shadows and silence, in boiling vents and frozen prisons. It endures where it should not. And if it can do that here, perhaps it does so elsewhere, waiting under alien ice, hidden or sealed from the stars, but alive all the same. For hundreds of millions of years, Earth lay silent under ice, its surface, sealed its seas, hidden its skies, pale and thin. But beneath that frozen mask, the planet was never still. Deep inside magma-churned continents, drifted volcanoes rumbled. The crust was locked in a white, yet the furnace beneath continued to breathe. And it was that breath carbon dioxide pouring from volcanoes that slowly wrote the end of the Uronian winter. Think of it this way in today's world. Forests, soils and oceans act as vast sponges absorbing carbon dioxide from the air. But during the Uronian there were no forests, no grasses, no trees, no great cycles of roots and leaves pulling carbon down into the soil. With the planet's surface sealed beneath ice, even weathering of rocks, the slow chemical process that normally draws down CO2 was paused. So when volcanoes exhaled their gases, nothing absorbed them. Each eruption was like a coin dropped into a jar, and the jar had no leak. Over millions of years, the atmosphere thickened with carbon dioxide. Molecule by molecule, the greenhouse blanket wrapped tighter around the frozen world. For ages, it seemed to make no difference. The ice still held the feedback loops of albedo, still bouncing sunlight away. But eventually the scales tipped. Enough heat accumulated to begin the slow undoing of the snowball. The white marble in space started to crack. At first, the thaw would have been almost invisible, microscopic melting on the ice's surface, thin layers, turning to water only to refreeze each night. But cracks widened. Lakes of meltwater formed atop glaciers. Streams trickled into oceans that had not seen the sky for millions of years. Once the surface darkened even slightly, the ice reflected less sunlight, which allowed more warmth to stay, which sped the melting further. The cycle reversed itself, and what had been an empire of cold collapsed with terrifying speed. Imagine standing at the edge of a continent in that moment. Glaciers that had been still for eons begin to fracture like glass. Rivers of meltwater roar forth, carving canyons in weeks that would normally take centuries. Whole valleys drown as oceans surge upward, fed by the retreating ice. Walls of water burst from collapsing ice dams, floods so massive they would scour landscapes, clean tearing boulders from their roots, sweeping them hundreds of miles. The seas, once quiet beneath a roof of ice, suddenly heave with fury. Oxygen-starved waters churn as currents roar back to life. Nutrients trapped in the deep rise toward the surface, fueling blooms of microscopic life that paint the seas green. To any observer, if one had existed, it would have seemed as though the planet was being reborn in chaos. The silence of the long winter gave way to the thunder of collapsing glaciers, the roar of floods, the hiss of oceans boiling with new energy. The end of the Uronian was not a gentle spring, it was a cataclysm. Oceans rose to claim the land, ice cliffs toppled into surf volcanoes, painted skies with ash. Yet out of that violence came possibility. The atmosphere was now rich with oxygen. The ocean stirred with nutrients and the survivors. Those tiny microbes that had hidden in vents and cracks were suddenly gifted a world transformed. They would diversify, adapt, and set the stage for everything that came after. So the Uronian ended as it had begun, with the atmosphere changing, not in a whisper but in a roar. Fire beneath the ice had built a trap of greenhouse gas, and when it finally sprang, the planet lurched from a frozen tomb into a flooded, steaming world. It was destruction, but also rebirth. And in that cycle of endings and beginnings lies the rhythm of Earth itself: freeze, thaw, erase, renew. Every ice age feels like an ending. The silence, the white horizon, the weight of glaciers pressing down on the land. It all seems like the Earth itself has chosen to smother its own story. Yet time and again what looks like extinction has become renewal. Ice kills, yes. It erases landscapes, buries rivers, and crushes the fragile. But ice also resets. It clears the stage so that when the thaw comes, survivors, those who clung to life in cracks and shadows, emerge as pioneers. Think of the microbes in the Uronian seas huddled around vents, while the world froze above them. They were not strong in any sense we would admire. They were not swift or mighty. They were simply adaptable. They slowed their metabolisms, hardened their membranes, invented new ways to endure. Fragile yet resilient. When the thaw came, they were the seeds from which life's next garden grew. Without them, evolution would have stopped in its tracks. This paradox, the fragility of individuals and the resilience of life as a whole, echoes through every age. Species perish, but life endures. Ecosystems collapse, but new ones rise from the rubble. The ice is merciless, but it does not extinguish the spark entirely. Instead, it forces life to adapt, to innovate, to become something new. Each extinction is also an invitation to transformation, and here inevitably we see ourselves. Humans like to imagine that resilience means strength, that we will endure because of our power, our tools, our dominance. But if the story of ice teaches us anything, It is that survival belongs not to the strongest but to the most adaptable. The mammoth was mighty, yet it fell. The microbes were invisible, yet they endured. What then of us? We are clever, yes, but also fragile, dependent on stable climates, fertile soils, predictable seasons. If those vanish, our skyscrapers and satellites will matter less than our abilities to change, to cooperate, to bend without breaking. So the lesson is both sobering and hopeful. Ice ages remind us that endings are not final, that resilience is written into the very fabric of life. But they also remind us that no species, not even ours, is immune to fragility. We are part of this pattern, not above it. If the ice were to advance again, our survival would depend not on force but on humility. The humility to adapt, to find warmth where little exists, to protect one another, as our ancestors once did around fires and caves. In the mirror of ancient ice we see our own reflection. Fragile as individuals, resilient as a species, if and only if we remember that life is not about permanence but about persistence. Fast forward, more than 1 billion years after the Euronian, life had survived, adapted and spread. Simple multicellular organisms were beginning to stir in the oceans, fragile bodies of jelly and frond-like creatures waving in shallow seas. The air was richer in oxygen, the sun burned brighter than before, and the earth seemed poised for abundance. And yet once again the planet slipped into catastrophe. Between 700 and 500 million years ago, Earth endured some of the most extreme freezes in its entire history. This was the Neoproterozoic snowball Earth, a chapter so dramatic that geologists still debate how life managed to survive it at all. The evidence is stark. In Namibia, Canada and China, layers of rock reveal glacial deposits at latitudes where today palm trees sway in humid air. Boulders carried by glaciers, so-called drop stones, are found embedded in marine sediments that could only have formed in tropical waters. Imagine diving into a warm sea, only to discover evidence that long ago it lay beneath a crushing ceiling of ice. These contradictions leave little doubt glaciers reached the equator. Our planet once again became a blinding sphere of white, an orb of crystal rolling silently through space. But how could ice conquer the equator, the warmest belt of the planet? The answer lies in the arrangement of the continents. During the Neoproterozoic, most land masses were clustered close to the equator, forming a supercontinent configuration that disrupted the planet's energy balance. At first glance, you might think continents at the equator would mean more warmth, but land reflects more sunlight than ocean. With so much land sitting under the strongest rays of the sun, the Earth's albedo, its reflectivity, increased dramatically. Each snowstorm, each glacier that crept down from a mountain range bounced more sunlight back into space. The cooling accelerated feeding on itself. Add to this the rhythms of the planet, small variations in Earth's orbit, a reduction in greenhouse gases, perhaps even volcanic winters sparked by eruptions. Together they pushed the planet past a threshold. Once ice gained a foothold across those equatorial continents, the positive feedback loop tightened its grip. Ice spread, sunlight fled, and the world dimmed into silence. From space, Earth would have gleamed like a frozen jewel, brighter than Venus, its surface polished by kilometers of reflective snow and ice. Even the tropics, once steaming jungles of microbial mats, lay entombed beneath a frozen crust. The ocean sealed under ice may have been only a few small cracks away from total stillness. And yet in those cracks, thin bands of liquid water at hydrothermal vents in subglacial lakes or along fault zones, life clung on. The Neoproterozoic freezes were not brief winters. They lasted for millions, perhaps tens of millions of years. Generations of microbes lived and died in the shadows, never seeing sunlight, their only warmth, the slow exhale of the planet's interior. For them, time must have felt eternal. But from the grand perspective, these snowball Earths were episodes, acts in a longer play. And when they ended, they left behind not emptiness, but a stage primed for the explosion of complex life that followed. It is tempting to see these freezes as disasters, and they were, but they were also crucibles reshaping oceans, cycling nutrients, and forcing life to invent new strategies. The clustering of continents at the equator did not just trap Earth in ice, it helped prepare the planet for its next transformation. For now, though, hold the image an entire world turned to glass. A snowball in space, gleaming cold, its continents silenced, its seas locked beneath ice. And beneath that shell, life waiting, enduring until the balance tipped once more. If you enjoyed this moment, leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you're still here with me. Even among scientists who accept that Earth once froze almost entirely, the details spark fierce debate. Was our planet truly a snowball Earth sealed from pole to pole beneath kilometers of ice? Or was it more of a slush ball Earth with belts of open water lingering around the equator? The difference may sound technical, but it cuts to the heart of how life endured those long winters and how fragile the balance of climate can be. The snowball Earth model imagines a planet utterly white. No oceans visible, no coastline spared. The equator itself sealed in frost sunlight bouncing from every surface. It is a stark and terrifying image, a true planetary tomb. In such a world, photosynthesis would have been nearly impossible. Surface life extinguished survival, restricted to deep-sea vents and tiny subglacial oases. The snowball model emphasizes just how close our Earth came to losing its spark altogether. The slush ball Earth hypothesis, by contrast, allows for narrow ribbons of dark water near the tropics. The oceans would still have been mostly locked away, but here and there, where sunlight lingered strongest, the ice may have thinned or even fractured into openings. These patches of liquid sea would have offered havens for algae and cyanobacteria maintaining photosynthesis on a limited scale. If this view is correct, life's continuity across those frozen ages becomes easier to explain a biosphere, not extinguished, only squeezed into smaller, harsher niches. The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. Geologists pore over rock cores drilled from ancient strata. They look for drop stones, outsized boulders carried by glaciers and released into marine sediments. They study isotopic ratios in carbon and oxygen chemical signatures that reveal whether oceans were starved of oxygen or still teeming with life. In some samples, the chemistry screams of oceans sealed off stagnant and anoxic evidence for the snowball. In others, fossils of photosynthetic organisms suggest that some sunlight must still have reached open water evidence for the slush ball. And so the debate continues. Conferences fill with presentations, arguments spilling into late-night discussions where researchers defend their models with passion. Some point to computer simulations showing how feedback loops would have locked Earth in ice once glaciers reached the tropics. Others counter with modern analogies, thin equatorial seas beneath Antarctic-like conditions that make total coverage hard to imagine. Neither side can fully silence the other because the rocks whisper in fragments, not in complete sentences. What is striking is not just the science itself, but the process. To reconstruct events from 700 million years ago requires patience, creativity, and humility. A single drill core pulled from a mountain in Namibia, a handful of isotopes measured in a Canadian outcrop, a streak of chemical residue in Chinese limestone, each becomes a clue in a puzzle too vast for any one discipline to solve. And scientists, like detectives, argue not because they disagree on the crime, but because they seek the exact details of how it unfolded. Whether Earth was a solid snowball or a patchy slush ball, the truth is clear: the planet endured a cold so extreme that it nearly erased its own story. And life, fragile yet relentless, endured too. Perhaps the debate itself is part of the wonder. It reminds us that history is not always a single narrative carved in stone, but a mosaic of interpretations, evidence, imagination, and sometimes even contradiction woven together in search of a truth we may never hold entirely. From space, whether snowball or slush ball, Earth would still have gleamed with a brilliance we can hardly fathom. And beneath that brilliance, life whispered, waiting for its next chance. From the surface, Neo-Proterozoic Earth would have seemed utterly dead, an endless white horizon, continents, sealed in armor, oceans hidden beneath a crushing lid of ice. But look closer and you would find that life as always had found a way to endure. Beneath that frozen ceiling existed narrow refuges, survival zones, where the spark of biology flickered through the long darkness. At the bases of glaciers, thin layers of meltwater formed from the slow pressure of ice against rock. Here, microbial mats clung stubbornly to surfaces, feeding on trace minerals released by grinding stone. Imagine filmy sheets of green and brown slime, invisible without magnification yet, teeming with colonies of bacteria that metabolized whatever trickle of nutrients came their way. These mats were more than survival, they were persistence, incarnate, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, life refuses to vanish. Along continental margins where the ice may have been thinner, cracks opened to the seas below. Faint shafts of sunlight sometimes filtered through, weak and fractured, but just enough to sustain tiny photosynthetic organisms. Scientists speculate that proto-algae might have hidden here, drifting in subglacial pockets of liquid water. Picture dim under-ice lagoons like glassy caverns, lit by pale green glows, gardens in the dark where fragile threads of algae stretched toward whatever light remained. If this image is true, then these hidden pools were the nurseries of complexity, safeguarding the ancestors of plants, while the surface world froze. Even deeper near hydrothermal vents, ecosystems thrived in total absence of sunlight. Here, extremophile microbes lived off chemical reactions oxidizing sulfur iron or methane that bubbled from the seafloor. To them, the freeze above was irrelevant. Their entire universe was the warmth of the vent and the blackness around it. These organisms, blind and ancient, may have carried life's continuity across millions of years of planetary winter. Modern analogies give us clues. Beneath Antarctica today, under kilometers of ice, still subglacial lakes like Lake Vostok and Lake Whillans host microbial life isolated from the surface for hundreds of thousands of years. These organisms metabolize slowly, some feeding on dissolved minerals, others on faint traces of organic carbon carried in from long ago. If they can endure here in our time, why not their ancestors in the Neo-Proterozoic? The thought is startling. While Earth's surface gleamed like glass from space, its real story was unfolding below in caverns, cracks, and hidden seas. These were sanctuaries not of abundance but of resilience. They were the secret bridges across deep time, carrying life from one age into the next. Without them, the thaw to come would have revealed only silence. Instead, it revealed continuity life that had clung adapted and prepared to bloom again. So the image of Snowball Earth is not only a world of death, but also of hidden gardens, pools of green beneath miles of ice, mats of bacteria painting rocks in secret, tiny gardens in the dark unseen yet essential, waiting for the day when the ice would retreat and the sunlight would once again pour freely over the oceans. The snowball could not last forever. Deep beneath the frozen shell, volcanoes never stopped exhaling. For millions of years, their eruptions poured carbon dioxide into the air molecule by molecule until the atmosphere grew dense enough to tip the balance. Trapped beneath kilometers of ice, this greenhouse blanket had no escape, no forests or rains to pull it down, and so at last the prison cracked. The thaw began slowly, almost invisibly, thin films of meltwater forming each summer, only to refreeze at night. But once the ice retreated just enough to expose darker surfaces, the feedback reversed. The planet that had been locked in a feedback of cold now entered a feedback of heat. Ice reflected less light oceans, absorbed more warmth, and melting accelerated. What had taken millions of years to build unraveled in a geological instant. Imagine standing at the edge of such a world. Glaciers fractured with thunderous roars. Whole ice sheets collapsed into churning seas. Meltwater floods scoured valleys, tearing landscapes into new shapes. Oceans rose, swallowing coasts. The silence of deep freeze gave way to chaos, the roar of torrents, the hiss of steam, the violent cracking of earth as it shifted from one state to another. And then in the wake of this destruction came abundance. As glaciers melted, they released enormous quantities of nutrients, phosphorus, iron and other minerals ground from stone during eons of ice's slow advance. These nutrients poured into the oceans, feeding microbial blooms on a scale Earth had never seen. Vast green swirls of plankton filled the seas, each one a miniature engine of photosynthesis. Oxygen levels climbed higher. Food chains lengthened. The oceans, once dark and starved, became crowded with possibility. This nutrient surge and atmospheric transformation set the stage for one of the most dramatic events in life's history, the Cambrian explosion around 541 million years ago. For billions of years, life had lingered in simplicity. Slime mats, microbes, fragile fronds swaying in shallow seas. But suddenly evolution seemed to sprint. Shells, spines, eyes and jaws appeared. Trilobites crawled across seafloors, worms burrowed into sediment, and predators with grasping claws hunted in open water. Diversity exploded, filling ecological roles that had never existed before. It is tempting to see a direct line: ice crushes the world, ice retreats, nutrients flow, and life answers with innovation. Of course, evolution is not that simple. It is a tangle of chance, chemistry, and time. But the connection is compelling. The same glaciers that nearly erased life may have prepared the feast that allowed it to flourish. The greatest winter became the mother of one of life's greatest springs. From space, Earth no longer gleamed as a perfect white marble. Oceans reappeared blue and restless. Continents stripped raw by ice wore new rivers and fresh soils. The planet looked reborn, and beneath those seas, life seized the opportunity, multiplying, diversifying, inventing new forms at a pace never before seen. The Cambrian explosion was not just the dawn of animals, it was the proof of resilience. that even after the deepest freeze life could not only endure but reinvent itself, blooming into forms that still echo in every creature alive today, ourselves included. The lesson is stark and beautiful. Catastrophe does not always mean the end. Sometimes it is the beginning. Ice is often imagined as the great destroyer, slow, crushing, indifferent. It grinds mountains into dust, buries valleys beneath kilometers of silence, and erases whole ecosystems in its advance. And yet when we look closely at Earth's history, we find that ice is also a creator. Each glaciation is both an executioner and a midwife, a filter through which life must pass, shedding the fragile, while the adaptable survive to flourish in new worlds. This is the paradox of ice. It kills, but it also clears. Its destruction opens the way for renewal. Think of a forest fire. The flames roar through trees, leaving blackened stumps and ash where a vibrant canopy once stood. At first glance, it looks like the end, but within months, shoots of green emerge from the soil, nourished by minerals unlocked by the fire. Species return, diversity increases, and the forest becomes richer for the cleansing. Ice works in a similar way, though, on a scale so vast we struggle to comprehend it. During the Great Freezes, many lineages of life were crushed or erased, but those that endured huddled in vents and cracks in pools beneath the ice and merged into landscapes remade. Nutrients ground from rock by glaciers flushed into the seas. Atmospheres shifted. New ecological niches appeared. And with those niches came opportunities, new ways to eat, to move, to compete, to survive. After the Snowball Earth episodes, we do not see silence in the fossil record, we see explosions of complexity. In this sense, ice acts like a cosmic sieve. It lets only the most resilient, the most adaptable slip through. The brittle perish, the hardy carry forward, and those hardy few often spark revolutions in evolution. The Cambrian explosion itself may be read as a direct consequence of this paradox, a winter that seemed to extinguish life but in fact prepared the banquet for its greatest bloom. Even today, echoes of this pattern remain. Species adapted to extremes, Arctic foxes, penguins, lichens clinging to Antarctic rock, remind us that cold environments are not lifeless voids, but training grounds for resilience. In their fur feathers and frost-resistant chemistry, we see evolution's creativity forged in adversity. And perhaps this is the deeper lesson for us. Hardship does not only destroy, it also refines. Societies, species, even individuals discover strength only when tested. Just as forests grow richer after fire and life diversified after ice, so too do we find new forms of ingenuity and solidarity in times of trial. The paradox of ice is that it is both enemy and benefactor. It erases but also makes room. It silences but also prepares the stage. In every frozen epoch, the planet whispered the same truth: endings are never final. They are thresholds leading to beginnings we cannot yet imagine. For all its dominion, ice never ruled the planet alone. Beneath its weight, the Earth's heart still pulsed with fire. Volcanoes driven by restless tectonics erupted even in the coldest epochs, and when the two forces collided, glacier and magma silence and fury, the results were cataclysmic. Picture a world locked in kilometers of ice. Cracks split open without warning as molten rock surged upward, meeting frozen ceilings. Lava tunnels carved glowing arteries through the dark, only to be quenched in violent hisses of steam. Imagine rivers of fire racing into caverns of ice, erupting in blasts so violent they shattered glaciers from below. The ground shook, the sky filled with ash, and torrents of water melted in an instant rushed across the frozen plains. We know this isn't just imagination. It still happens today in places where fire and ice coexist. Iceland is a living echo of these ancient battles. Beneath its glaciers lie volcanoes that when they erupt unleash Jökulhlaup's sudden floods of staggering force. Entire valleys are scoured in hours, bridges swept away, landscapes rearranged overnight. In these events, we see a miniature of what must have unfolded on Snowball Earth, the fury of magma testing the grip of ice. During the Great Glaciation, such eruptions would have been even more spectacular. Vast floods roared from beneath glaciers, carving new valleys, leaving behind braided river systems and fields of shattered boulders. Icebergs carved suddenly into meltwater lakes, surging outward in walls taller than forests. The clash of temperatures, lava at 1,000 degrees meeting ice at freezing, must have filled the air with towers of steam that rose like phantom mountains. And yet, in these violent encounters, life may have found refuges. Around subglacial volcanic lakes, warmth and nutrients created pockets of habitability. Microbes gathered thriving in chemical-rich waters. These oases were dangerous fleeting, but they were also shelters proof that even in chaos life adapts. Geologists still trace the scars of these battles. In Greenland, Iceland, Antarctica and Alaska we find volcanic rocks mingled with glacial deposits, layered testimonies of a world where ice and fire wrestled for dominance. Each stratum is a reminder that Earth is never truly quiet, that beneath every frozen silence the planet's molten core waits its turn. It is a strange, almost poetic truth: the planet's two most destructive forces, ice that erases and fire that consumes, can together create possibility. Ice preserves by sealing, fire renews by remaking. And when they meet, though, the violence is immense. The aftermath is often fertile, enriched by ash, carved by floods seeded with new beginnings. So when we imagine Snowball Earth, we should not picture a static tomb. It was alive with tension, with hidden fire beneath frozen oceans, with eruptions that tore open the silence. It was a world of contradictions, glaciers groaning above magma rumbling below, locked in an eternal struggle that shaped the landscapes we walk today. Amid the crushing stillness of Snowball Earth, where continents lay buried in white and oceans suffocated under ice, one force refused to bow. Volcanoes rising from deep tectonic fractures broke through the frozen silence with plumes of heat and ash, and in their presence the world's most unlikely sanctuaries appeared. These were not gentle havens, but lifeboats of fire, subglacial volcanoes melting caverns into the ice, creating pockets of warmth where life could cling. Imagine it beneath kilometers of ice. Magma pushes upward, melting vast chambers of liquid water. In these hidden lakes, the temperature rises just enough to prevent freezing. Nutrients leach from volcanic rock minerals, swirl into the water, and suddenly, in a world otherwise locked in death, an ecosystem stirs. Microbes gather, feeding on sulfur, iron and methane released by the Earth's molten breath. These are extremophiles, organisms that do not merely endure extremes but thrive in them. Such refugees may have been scattered across the frozen planet, small in number but crucial in impact. Each was an island of possibility, a dark and secret laboratory where evolution tested endurance. In these volcanic oases, bacteria learned resilience, how to repair frozen DNA, how to survive without sunlight, how to hibernate in near starvation for centuries. Some may have even experimented with metabolic pathways that later shaped the course of complex life. We see their echoes today, in Iceland, where glaciers cloak volcanoes, eruption to melt hidden lakes teeming with microbial life adapted to chemical-rich waters. In Antarctica, lakes sealed beneath ice host extremophiles that metabolize iron and sulfur, much as their ancestors did hundreds of millions of years ago. These living examples are time machines showing us how the ancient lifeboats of fire may have kept the thread of life unbroken through the long planetary winter. It is a profound irony volcanoes, agents of destruction, became sanctuaries. Their eruptions may have blackened skies and deepened the chill globally, but in small hidden pockets they gave warmth, shelter and nutrients. They incubated resilience. Without them, perhaps the freeze would have erased all life from the surface of Earth. Instead, when the thaw came, these survivors stepped forward, ready to repopulate oceans and begin again. In this way, subglacial volcanoes were more than geological curiosities, they were custodians of continuity. They show us that survival is rarely about comfort. It is about adaptation, about finding the thin cracks of habitability in a hostile world. And so in the deep freeze of the Neoproterozoic, when Earth looked most like a tomb, volcanoes became its beating heart, keeping the flame of life alive in the dark. The very force that once deepened the cold eventually became its undoing. For millions of years, volcanoes erupted beneath glaciers and at continental rifts, pumping carbon dioxide into the air. With the planet sealed in ice, there were no rains to wash that CO2 into rivers, no forest to trap it in leaves and soils. It accumulated relentlessly, invisible but unstoppable, until the sky itself became a greenhouse. Slowly, imperceptibly, heat began to outweigh the brilliance of ice. At first, the thaw was subtle, a faint shimmer of meltwater tracing down glacier walls. Thin pools forming on the frozen crust, refreezing each night but spreading wider with each season. Yet soon the balance tipped, and what had been a trickle became a deluge. Whole ice sheets began to fracture, and with deafening cracks, walls of white split apart, toppling into a swelling ocean. Now picture the planet in this moment of transition to one side, cliffs of ice kilometers high, glowing blue in the sun, To the other, rivers of lava pour from fissures, painting the snow in streaks of red and black. Steam towers into the sky where fire meets frost. Floods thunder from collapsing ice dams, scouring valleys in hours that would normally take millennia to carve. It was a world torn between frozen silence and molten fury, both forces battling to define the future. The atmosphere thickened with volcanic gases trapping ever more heat. The ice, once unyielding, retreated in chaos. As glaciers melted, oceans surged upward, covering vast plains that had been dry for millions of years. Coastlines redrew themselves overnight. Rivers overflowed, carving new paths. The seas, once stagnant beneath their icy lid, churned violently back to life, redistributing oxygen and nutrients across the globe. To an observer, had one existed, it would have seemed apocalyptic. Fire devoured ice, and ice collapsed into water. The roar of volcanoes mixed with the groans of glaciers and the thunder of floods. The earth itself seemed to scream as it tore free from the prison it had built for itself. And yet amid the chaos, renewal was already underway. Nutrients ground fine by glaciers washed into oceans, feeding blooms of plankton. Oxygen levels rose, preparing the stage for an evolutionary drama that would soon reshape the biosphere. So it was fire that ended the reign of ice. The same volcanoes that had deepened the freeze through ash and aerosols became the architects of the thaw through their gases. Their fury broke the snowball's grip, and from that fury came rebirth. Earth emerged battered, flooded and steaming, but alive and ready for what came next. Everywhere in Earth's story we see opposites colliding. Ice and fire, silence and fury, destruction and renewal. At first glance they appear as enemies, one seeking to smother the other to consume, yet the deeper we look, the more we realize they are partners in an ancient dance. Without ice, life stagnates. Without fire, life has no release. Together they carve, erase and create. The glaciations remind us that endings clear the way for beginnings. Ice scrapes the land, bare strips ecosystems to their bones, but in doing so it resets the stage. Volcanic fire then floods the skies with greenhouse gases, breaks the grip of frost and pours nutrients into newly stirred seas. What once looked like annihilation becomes the fertile ground for transformation. This is the paradox that threads through all of Earth's deep history. The destroyers are also creators. Cultures long before modern science sensed this truth. In Norse mythology, the universe was born not from harmony, but from collision. From Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist, and Muspelheim, the realm of fire, came the first sparks of creation. Where frost met flame, life began. To the Vikings, this was myth. To us, it is geology writ large. Earth's own history of snowball freezes, and volcanic thaws is a mirror of those stories, cosmic extremes meeting to birth something new. Other myths echo the same pattern. Hindu cosmology speaks of cycles of destruction and rebirth, firestorms and floods sweeping clean before each new age. In the Popol Vuh of the Maya, failed creations were washed away or shattered, so that new ones could rise. These stories, though, clothed in gods and poetry, capture a rhythm that the rocks themselves confirm. To create the world must sometimes undo itself, and perhaps that is why the imagery of ice and fire resonates so deeply. We recognize even unconsciously that our own lives follow similar arcs. Periods of loss, stillness and stepping down often precede renewal. Periods of upheaval and often spark unexpected growth. Just as Earth is sculpted by extremes, so too are we. So when we picture the great battles of fire against ice, we should not imagine victory or defeat. Neither force wins for long. Instead, imagine a balance, a pendulum swing, a cosmic breath. Each time the world freezes, it is only waiting for fire to return. Each time fire consumes, it is only setting the stage for ice to fall again. This is the lesson whispered by the oldest rocks and echoed in the oldest myths. Opposites are not enemies. They are necessary partners. And from their struggle, everything we know, oceans, forests, animals, ourselves, was born. It is one of the most tantalizing questions hidden within the deep freeze of Earth's past. Could entire civilizations have risen and fallen before the world we know and been erased by ice? Mainstream archaeology tells us that human civilization as we define it, cities did, writing agriculture emerged only in the last 10,000 years, long after the great glaciers had retreated. But the sheer violence of ice ages invites speculation. Because when glaciers advance, they do not simply cover, they crush, grind and erase. They are nature's most ruthless archivists, leaving behind only blank pages where entire chapters may once have been. If you're still journeying with me, write the number 1 in the comments so I know the story still has you. Consider what even the last ice age did. Between 115,000 and 11,700 years ago, kilometers of ice blanketed North America, Europe and Asia. If a complex society had existed there, its cities would now lie pulverized into gravel, its temples scattered as boulders, its roads twisted and carried far from their origins. Organic remains, wood, textiles, parchment would be long gone. All that might remain are ambiguous stones and a scattering of artifacts if any managed to escape the grinding maw. And beyond the ice, the seas were also changing. When so much water was locked in glaciers, sea levels fell by more than 100 meters. Vast coastal plains, fertile habitable prime for early settlement, were exposed. When the ice melted, oceans surged back, drowning those plains forever. Places like Doggerland, the land bridge that once linked Britain to Europe, are proof of this. Archaeologists dredge up stone tools and animal bones from its drowned floor, reminders that entire landscapes once alive with people can vanish beneath the waves. If this happened within the last 12,000 years, what of the more distant past? Could older civilizations have flourished in now submerged lands, wiped clean by the meltwaters, their ruins hidden beneath silt and sea? It is speculation, yes, but speculation grounded in a hard truth. Absence of proof is not proof of absence. The geological record is incomplete, fractured by time, erased by tectonics, fire and frost. What we know is impressive, but what we do not know stretches far wider. Archaeologists argue cautiously. Most evidence supports the gradual rise of complex societies in the Holocene, and yet myths from cultures around the world, legends of lost golden ages, cities buried by floods, frozen lands swallowed by storms, stir the imagination. Are these simply stories or echoes of memories passed down from survivors of climate catastrophes we have forgotten? The ice itself warns us. It preserves, but it also obliterates. A mammoth can be found intact, skin and hair still clinging to bone, yet a city could be ground into rubble so fine it blends into the gravel of a moraine. If civilizations did exist before, their traces would be among the hardest to find. And so as we peer into the long shadows of deep time, we must leave room for humility. We may not be the first to build, to dream, to fall. We may only be the first whose footprints have not yet been swept away by ice and sea. When we imagine glaciers, we often see them as static walls of white frozen monuments to stillness. But glaciers are not statues. They are engines, slow, relentless and merciless. They move with a patience that deceives the eye, crawling forward inch by inch, year by year, until mountains bow and valleys collapse. And in that movement they erase. A glacier does not merely cover the land, it crushes it. Picture billions of tons of ice pressing downward with the weight of entire mountain ranges. Rocks beneath are ground to powder, valleys scoured clean. Boulders are dragged for miles, scarred and reshaped, until they no longer resemble the stones they once were. Any trace of structure, whether natural or human-made, stands no chance. Walls crumble, foundations collapse, artifacts are scattered like pebbles tossed in a stream. If you've seen the aftermath of a bulldozer at a construction site, you have the faintest glimpse of this power. Now multiply that by continents. A glacier is a bulldozer the size of a country, its blade not steel but time. Where it passes, the old landscape is obliterated. Even rivers are forced to change course, carved into new beds as ice plows its way forward. The result is geological amnesia. When the ice retreats, it leaves behind a blank page, plains of gravel, fields of till, scraped bedrock, polished smooth. Whatever stories the land once told are gone, overwritten by the signature of ice. Archaeological traces, if they existed, could be shredded to dust, indistinguishable from the rubble. It is not that they never were, it is that the glacier has decided they will not be remembered. This is why speculation about civilizations before our own is both alluring and elusive. The ice itself may have been the ultimate censor, erasing with more precision than fire or flood. Where fire leaves ash and floods leave sediment, glaciers leave only silence. They do not preserve, they obliterate. And yet paradoxically, glaciers also carry fragments with them. Rocks from one mountain dropped hundreds of miles away, the body of a mammoth entombed and revealed thousands of years later. They are both destroyers and archivists, scattering pieces without context, leaving us puzzles instead of histories. To walk across a glaciated plain today, flat, gravelly, quiet, is to walk across a page that has been scrubbed clean. Whatever was written there is gone. Only the ice remembers, and the ice does not tell its stories easily. When glaciers advance, they do not only reshape mountains and valleys, they also steal from the seas. During the Great Ice Ages, so much water was locked into frozen sheets that global sea levels fell by as much as 120 meters. Coastlines stretched outward, revealing plains and river deltas that are now drowned. Vast shelves of land, rich and fertile, became highways for animals and people only to vanish when the thaw returned. One of the most famous examples is Doggerland, the land bridge that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. Today it lies beneath the North Sea, but for thousands of years it was a sprawling plain of lakes, marshes and rivers. Archaeologists have found harpoons carved from antler stone tools, and even the bones of mammoths dredged from its floor. It was not a barren wasteland, it was home. Families hunted redded deer, fished in rivers, and perhaps built temporary shelters as they followed herds across this lost heartland of Europe. Doggersland is not unique. Around the world, drowned landscapes whisper forgotten chapters. Off the coast of India in the Gulf of Cambay, sonar scans reveal geometric patterns that some interpret as ancient settlements, though debate continues. Near Japan's Yonaguni, massive stone-like structures lie beneath the waves, their sharp edges sparking arguments over whether they are natural formations or the remnants of human design. In the Mediterranean, the remains of Bronze Age harbours and towns lie submerged, where coastlines once bustled with trade. During glacial maxima, these coastal shelves would have been among the most habitable places on Earth. Rivers carried nutrients animals gathered in abundance, and the climate was milder than in the frozen interiors. It is not hard to imagine early humans and perhaps cultures more organised than we dare assume thriving along these shorelines. But when the ice melted, seas surged back, drowning their homes and sealing their remains beneath silt and salt water. What is most haunting is the scale. More than 20 million square kilometres of land were exposed at the height of the last ice age, an area larger than Africa. Imagine how many stories were written on those plains, how many paths crossed, how many shelters built only for all of it to sink beneath the ocean's return. Archaeology reminds us that the absence of visible ruins does not mean absence of human activity. Fishermen still pull worked flints and bones from the seabeds. Divers stumble on walls, post holes and hearths in drowned caves. These are scattered hints of worlds erased by rising seas, fragments of the human journey hidden below the waves. The lesson is humbling. The ocean is not only a cradle of life, but also a graveyard of memory. Every ice age sea levels, full lands appear and people move in. Every thaw the ocean rises again, swallowing their footprints. What we call lost lands are not myths. They are real chapters of our history, drowned but not forgotten. Long before science pieced together the story of glaciations, human memory carried its own record in myths, songs and whispered stories around the fire. Across continents, cultures far apart tell of sudden cold of lands swallowed by ice, of people driven to the edge of survival. To many these are simply legends, but to historians and anthropologists, they may be fragments of cultural memory, echoes of climate trauma passed down through generations. Among the Inuit of Greenland and Arctic Canada, tales speak of fertile valleys that froze overnight, of spirits of cold sweeping across the land without warning. Some stories describe animals fleeing south, leaving the people to adapt with new tools and new ways of hunting. Whether literal or symbolic, these myths carry the imprint of real events, shifting ecosystems, advancing glaciers, and the desperate need to adapt. In the high Andes, the Quechua and Aymara peoples preserve stories of a great freeze that wiped out entire villages. Some legends speak of the sun abandoning the world, plunging the land into endless night and frost. Archaeologists note that these regions did experience dramatic climate swings where glacial advances could cut off valleys, destroy farmlands, and force migrations. The myths are not just allegory, they may be memories of survival carved into cultural identity. Even in temperate regions, myths of sudden cold appear. Norse sagas tell of Fimbulwinter, a terrible 3-year-long winter that would precede the end of the world. Chinese chronicles speak of years when rivers froze, crops failed, and dynasties fell. In each case, climate catastrophe is remembered not as abstract science, but as lived experience transmuted into the language of gods, omens, and cosmic battles. The consistency of these myths across cultures suggests a deeper truth people remember. Even when writing did not exist, stories served as vessels for history. The details shift, but the core remains the shock of sudden cold, the terror of shortened harvests, the exodus to warmer lands, the struggle to survive. Myths are not precise measurements of climate, they are the emotional record, the human echo of glaciation. In a way, they mirror the geological record itself. Just as ice cores preserve bubbles of ancient air, myths preserve bubbles of ancient fear and resilience. Both are partial, fragmentary, and filtered through time, but together they give us a fuller picture. The rocks tell us what happened. The stories tell us what it felt like. Perhaps the most haunting part is this: the myths were not meant for us. They were not written as history books, but as warnings, reminders, and lessons for descendants. The cold came once and it can come again. Beneath the poetry, the message is the same as that carried by the ice itself. Nothing in climate is permanent and survival depends on adaptation. So when we read the myths of sudden freeze, we are not just hearing old tales, we are listening to the voices of ancestors who endured the unthinkable, who found words to make sense of a world turned to ice. Their stories, like the glaciers, are reminders that memory itself can be as enduring as stone. Beneath the restless seas, whispers of forgotten worlds linger. The ice did not only grind continents, it also lowered oceans, exposed coasts, and then drowned them again when it retreated. With every rise and fall of sea level, entire landscapes vanished beneath the waves, and in some places what lies underwater has sparked fierce debate. Are we seeing the work of nature or the ghosts of civilizations erased? In the Gulf of Cambay off the western coast of India, sonar surveys have revealed strange geometric patterns on the seabed. Rectilinear outlines that resemble streets grids, even the foundations of walls. Samples dredged from the site have included worked stone and artifacts, some carbon dated to more than 9,000 years ago, long before the rise of known urban centres. To some, this is evidence of a lost city swallowed when seas rose at the end of the last ice age. To others, it is coincidence, geological formations mistaken for architecture artifacts swept into place by currents. The truth remains unresolved, but the tension fuels imagination. Half a world away, near the island of Yonaguni in Japan, another enigma lies beneath the waves. Divers there explore a massive stone formation shaped like step terraces, with flat platforms and sharp right angles. From above it resembles a ziggurat carved into the seabed. Some argue it is a natural product of sandstone fracturing, where currents and erosion created the illusion of design. Yet others point to what seem like staircases, platform, and even carvings, insisting this is no accident, that it's the remnant of an ancient structure drowned by the sea thousands of years ago. The debate is not just academic, it touches on something deeper. If these sites are natural, they remind us of the uncanny artistry of geology, how wind and water sculpt shapes that mimic our own designs. But if they are human-made, they hint at civilizations that predate our histories, cultures that flourished in interglacial warmth, only to vanish beneath the returning tide. What makes these mysteries compelling is that both possibilities inspire awe. Nature alone is capable of building cathedrals of stone without a mason's hand. But if human hands did shape these places, then our timeline is incomplete, our understanding humbled by the scale of what ice and sea have erased. In the end, Cambay and Yonaguni remain suspended between science and speculation. Their terraces and outlines whisper but do not shout, offering puzzles rather than answers. Perhaps that is fitting. The ocean, like the ice, is a master of secrecy. It keeps its stories close, revealing just enough to remind us that what we know is not all there is. And so divers return sonar hums, debates flare, and the tension remains ruins or rock civilization or coincidence. In that uncertainty lies the lure, the haunting thought that somewhere under the waves the lost chapters of humanity still wait. When the ice advanced, it was not only landscapes that shifted, it was people. Glaciers acted as walls, swallowing valleys, blocking hunting grounds, and making once fertile plains unlivable. Human groups, small and fragile, had no choice but to move, and in moving they reshaped not just where they lived, but who they became. Each ice age acted like a great migration engine. Populations were squeezed out of frozen zones and pushed into new territories. Groups who might never have met otherwise suddenly shared the same river valleys, caves and plains. Their survival demanded cooperation or conflict, some fought, others mingled. Languages collided, traditions interwove, and new cultures were born from necessity. Genetics tells the story clearly. Modern DNA carries traces of those ancient journeys. The migration spurred by glacial advance and retreat led to genetic mixing that strengthened humanity's resilience. When groups interbred, they shared not only blood but also survival traits, tolerance to cold, immunity to new diseases, adaptations to diet. We are in a very real sense the children of the ice's pressure, shaped by its relentless forcing of contact. Archaeology offers glimpses of these exchanges. Tool styles spread far beyond their places of origin. Stone blades crafted in one region appear thousands of miles away, evidence that people carried ideas as well as goods. Decorative beads, ochre paintings, and bone carvings travelled along with them, spreading symbols and myths. Ice pushed people into tighter corridors, and in those corridors, ideas moved faster. Climate was not a backdrop to these changes, it was the script. Where ice ruled cultures became nomadic, following herds across tundra. Where glaciers retreated, people settled near meltwater rivers, building more permanent shelters. Each fluctuation forced humanity to adapt to become more inventive, more social, more capable of cooperation. In this sense, climate shaped not just our survival, but our identity. Consider Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska during the last glacial maximum. It was more than a bridge, it was a homeland where people lived for generations before dispersing into the Americas. This migration, driven by falling seas and advancing ice, seeded entire continents with new human communities. The ripple effects of that movement still define the genetic and cultural map of the world today. The lesson is humbling. We are migratory by design, not just by choice. Ice sculpted our paths, narrowed our options, and forced us to move. In doing so, it ensured that humanity would not remain isolated pockets, but a web of connections stretching across continents. Every song, every tool, every story we carry today is in some small way a product of those ancient displacements. The glaciers were brutal, yes, but in pushing us apart and pulling us together, they shaped us into a species capable of adaptation and exchange. Without their pressure, we might never have become who we are. For all its power to erase ice also has a gentler, almost miraculous side. Where fire consumes and water rots, ice can preserve. It freezes time itself, halting decay so perfectly that the past can reappear as though it had never left. Beneath its glassy shroud, relics sleep waiting for the day the thaw reveals them. The most famous example is Ötzi the Iceman, discovered in the Alps in 1991. His body lay encased in ice for more than 5,000 years. When the glacier released him, it was as though he had only just fallen asleep. His skin, his hair, even the contents of his stomach were still there. You could see the tattoos etched on his flesh touch the leather of his shoes, smell the faint tang of smoke on his cloak. Beside him lay tools, a copper axe, arrows, a flint knife, artifacts that spoke not of myth, but of a real man with real struggles frozen in mid-journey. The same miracle has happened with creatures of a more ancient age. In Siberia, hunters and scientists have uncovered woolly mammoths, preserved so well that their fur still bristled, their flesh still red. In some cases, even their last meals remained in their stomachs, grasses and flowers from a long-vanished steppe. To stand before such a find is to feel the uncanny an animal dead for tens of thousands of years that looks as though it might breathe again if the frost were to melt from its nostrils. Smaller discoveries are just as haunting. Tiny birds with feathers intact, foals of Ice Age horses curled like they only just fell, wolves with teeth still sharp cubs, still soft to the touch. These are not bones bleached by centuries, they are bodies, vivid lifelike whispers of a vanished world that the ice refused to surrender. There is something profoundly sensory about these encounters. Imagine brushing ice crystals away to reveal strands of hair, still glossy, or the haft of a tool worn smooth by human fingers long gone. Imagine the shiver of recognition when you see a meal half digested from an animal that lived in a world of glaciers and mammoths now resting in your hands. The ice has carried not just forms but moment snapshots of life suspended mid-breath. It is a paradox, once again glaciers that erase entire landscapes can under the right conditions preserve individual lives in exquisite detail. They are both destroyers and archivists, grinding cities to rubble, but keeping one hunter, one mammoth, one child in crystalline clarity. And every time such a relic emerges, it collapses time. Suddenly the Ice Age is not an abstract epoch, but a tangible presence. You can touch its people, its animals, its tools. You can smell the smoke of their fires, see the food they ate, and feel the chill of their world. In those frozen bodies, history is no longer distant. It is immediate, intimate, alive. The ice has always been a double-edged blade, an eraser and a preserver. But now in our own age, that preservation is slipping away. As glaciers retreat under the heat of modern climate change, they are revealing treasures that have slept undisturbed for millennia. Yet the same thaw that uncovers them also destroys them, turning time capsules into fleeting shadows. Across the Alps, Scandinavia, Siberia, and the high Arctic archaeologists race against melting ice. Hunters' arrows emerge fletching still attached. Wooden skis from Stone Age travellers lie perfectly shaped. Textiles' fragile woven threads appear where no cloth should have survived. In one case, a tunic more than 600 years old was found in a Norwegian ice patch, its wool still supple enough to be unfolded. These are not just objects, they are voices preserved against all odds, suddenly speaking again. But there is a cruel urgency. The moment ice lets go, decomposition begins. Leather softens and crumbles, feathers collapse into dust, wood rots in the air. What the cold protected for thousands of years can vanish in days once exposed to warmth, rain and microbes. A mammoth pristine when frozen can collapse into mush when thawed. An arrow shaft can disintegrate before researchers arrive. Each relic is a fragile message written on melting paper. This is why archaeologists call our time an age of salvage. Expeditions are not leisurely hunts for history, they are emergency rescues. Teams trek into mountains and tundras not knowing what they'll find, only that whatever emerges must be recovered quickly before the sun and wind erase it forever. The ethics are sharp. If we delay, we lose not just artifacts but knowledge, insight into human migrations, tools, beliefs and daily survival. There is also a deeper dilemma. Every relic the ice releases is both a gift and a warning. These discoveries are possible only because the glaciers are retreating at a pace unseen in human history. The same process that gives us Ötzi and ancient arrows is also shrinking rivers, destabilizing seas and transforming climates. We celebrate what we recover even as we mourn what the loss of ice portends. Standing before such finds, we feel the fragility of time. The ice once held these things safe, now it gives them back only to watch them vanish. If we do not act, if we do not record, preserve and learn, then these last whispers of ancient lives will dissolve with the glaciers themselves. The urgency is not just scientific, but human. In every fragment of wood, in every thread of cloth, in every strand of hair, preserved in frost, there is a story waiting to be saved. The melting ice is handing us those stories, but only for a moment. The question is whether we will listen before they are gone forever. When we conjure the Ice Age in our imagination, it is not only the glaciers that rise before us, it is the beasts that walked in their shadows. Towering, shaggy armoured against the cold, these creatures ruled a world of frost and tundra. They were the megafauna kings, and their dominion stretched across continents. Foremost among them stood the woolly mammoth, great herds of them, moving like brown, shaggy tides across the steppes. Their curved tusks arced like ivory crescents, tools as much as weapons. With them, they pried apart snow dug for grasses, defended calves against predators. Their thick coats bristled in the wind, while beneath lay a dense layer of fat 10 centimeters thick that kept their blood warm as blizzards howled. Imagine the sound of their trumpets echoing through icy valleys, a chorus of survival carried on the cold air. Alongside them roamed the woolly rhinoceros lower to the ground, heavier clad in rough hair, the colour of withered grass. Their great horns swept snow aside, uncovering buried sedges and shrubs. They were less social than mammoths, more solitary, their silhouettes hulking against the pale horizon. Yet even they needed the open plains shaped by cold, their entire lives tied to the rhythm of glacial grasslands. But not all were grazers. In the shadows prowled the hunters, the predators who tested the herds. The cave lion, larger than modern lions, moved silently across the tundra. Without manes, their bodies were streamlined, conserving heat, their paws broad enough to stalk across snow. They hunted in groups, using teamwork to drive mammoths into traps or to ambush bison at waterholes. Imagine the moment a lion lunging from cover, the thundering panic of hooves, the cry of prey as it fell beneath teeth and claws. And then there were the most iconic killers of all the saber-toothed cat, Smilodon, crouching in ambush with fangs like daggers 20 centimeters long. They were not built for long chases. Instead, they waited, their muscular bodies coiled like springs, then burst forward in an explosive violence. With one crushing bite, their curved teeth pierced arteries, ending the struggle in moments. In the half-light of glacial forests, their silhouette must have been both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Daily life in this frozen theatre was a cycle of endurance and confrontation. Mammoths swept snow aside to uncover grass calves stumbling between their mothers' legs. Rhinos grunted as they grazed wary of predators stalking the edges. Lions tested the herds, sometimes driven back by tusks and trampling feet, sometimes rewarded with a kill that fed the pride for days. Smilodons waited near game trails, their patience measured not in minutes but in hours, striking only when the odds tilted in their favour. To humans, these giants were both rivals and resources. Hunters painted their likeness on cave walls, stalked them with spears, but also learned from them. Following herds meant finding water food and safe passage. In a sense, megafauna were guides as much as prey. These were the kings of the Ice Age mammoths, rhinos, lions, saber-tooths, each a master of their realm, each perfectly adapted to a cold that would have broken others. They ruled not forever, but for long enough to leave their memory etched into stone bone and myth. And though their thrones have crumbled, their presence lingers still in fossils, in DNA, and in the imagination that still trembles at the thought of walking among them. The Ice Age was not ruled by mammoths alone. Above the frozen plains and storm-lashed seas, the sky carried its own monarchs, the birds of the ice. Hardy, cunning, and resilient, they were no less essential to the story of survival than the great beasts on the ground. One of the most striking was the great orca bird, as tall as a child, cloaked in black and white like a northern ghost. Flightless, it moved with awkward dignity on land, but became a sleek hunter in the water. Beneath the waves, it darted after schools of fish, its wings transformed into flippers, its beak snapping with precision. Colonies gathered on rocky coasts in their thousands, filling the air with harsh cries and the sea with rippling wakes. To early humans, these birds were both a blessing and a challenge, easy to catch on land, but fierce competitors at sea where their seed outmatched primitive hunters. Their meat, eggs, and feathers became resources, yet their presence also shaped myth. In some traditions, the auk was seen as a spirit guide of the ocean, a creature who knew the secrets of cold waters better than any human. Then there was the snowy owl, pale and silent, drifting across tundra like a feathered phantom. Its golden eyes pierced the snowdrifts, watching for lemmings, hares, and the small creatures that rustled beneath the frost. Its wings carried it without sound, its talons struck with fatal speed. For those who watched from below, hares frozen in terror, humans gazing skyward, it was a symbol of death's suddenness, but also of resilience, a predator perfectly in tune with the frozen world. Among Arctic peoples, the snowy owl often became a messenger in legend, an omen of shifts in weather, or even a companion to shamans who claimed to ride on its wings in spirit journeys. Imagine the scene: a blizzard clears, revealing a frozen plain. A herd of reindeer grazes in the distance, mammoths loom like mountains, and above them a white owl wheels silently against the grey. At the coast, great auks splash into the water, their bodies vanishing into a silver sea. The sky no less than the land was alive with struggle and survival. To early humans, these birds were more than animals. They were teachers. The auk taught patience in hunting schools of fish. The owl taught silence and observation. Both became woven into human culture, painted in ochre, on cave walls, carved into bone charms, whispered into stories told by firelight. In their wings, the Ice Age had its aerial hunters, its omens, its companions. The ground belonged to mammoths, the rivers to rhinos, but the air was ruled by feathers, white as snow and black as storm shadow. The birds of the ice may seem small beside the giants, but their echoes remain in legends, in bones, and in the way the human imagination still looks upward for signs of survival in the cold. For tens of thousands of years, the world of ice belonged to giants. Mammoths roamed in herds across frozen steppes, woolly rhinos scraped through snow cave lions, prowled and saber-toothed cats lurked in ambush. Yet their reign was not eternal. One by one, the titans of the Ice Age began to vanish, leaving behind empty plains where their trumpets and roars once echoed. The reasons were complex, but two forces loomed largest: climate and humans. As the Ice Age thawed, habitats shrank. Grassy steppes gave way to forest tundra, retreated north, and the wide open plains that had fed herds of mammoths and rhinos disappeared. At the same time, a new predator spread across the continents, our ancestors. With fire cunning and relentless cooperation, humans hunted with an efficiency no animal could withstand. The giants faced a double-bind, dwindling land and an enemy that thought, planned, and refused to quit. And so extinction followed like a shadow. The woolly rhinoceros disappeared. The saber-toothed cats left only bones. The cave lions, once kings of the tundra, fell silent. Even the mammoth, the very symbol of the Ice Age, dwindled to scattered bands, their numbers shrinking with every passing century. But the story did not end immediately. In one of the most poignant footnotes of prehistory, a small population of mammoths survived on Wrangel Island, a lonely outpost in the Arctic Ocean. Isolated by rising seas, they lingered there for thousands of years after their kin had vanished from the mainland. Imagine it: while humans built the pyramids of Giza, mammoths still walked the windswept shores of Wrangel. Their herds were tiny, their tusks shorter, their bodies smaller than their Ice Age ancestors, but they carried the flame of their kind a little longer. The thought is bittersweet. A handful of mammoths standing against the tide of extinction trumpeting across an island as the world forgot them, yet even they could not endure forever. Around 4,000 years ago, the last Wrangell mammoth fell, leaving behind silence, where a dynasty of giants had once ruled. To reflect on their end is to feel both sorrow and wonder. Sorrow for the loss, for the empty landscapes, for the vanished majesty, for the herds that will never thunder again, and wonder at the resilience that allowed them to survive so long through cold and hunger, through change and isolation, until at last the thread broke. The end of the giants was not only the end of species, it was the closing of an era, the last page of a chapter written in ice and bone. Today we see their shadows in museums and cave art in the genes, still echoing faintly within elephants. But they are gone, and we, the survivors of their world, are left to remember them not as curiosities but as reminders of fragility of power, and of what is lost when the balance tips too far. Amid the shadows of mammoths and saber-tooths, a smaller figure walked the human. Fragile compared to the giants, lacking claws, fur or tusks, yet armed with something invisible but powerful imagination. The ice world was no paradise, but somehow our ancestors not only endured it, they thrived. Picture a camp on the windswept steppe. The air cuts like glass, and the horizon is endless white. At its centre, a circle of bones rises, a shelter built not from wood scarce on the frozen plains, but from the skeletons of mammoths. Jawbones arch into crude walls, ribs form frames, and hides stretched across the bones keep out the howling wind. Inside, firelight flickers against ivory walls, painting shadows that dance like spirits. A mother stitches clothing with bone needles, fur spread across her lap. A child gnaws at roasted marrow. Outside, hunters return dragging haunches of meat, their faces raw with frost, their voices hoarse with triumph. For those who found caves, life was little gentler. Smoke drifted up against rock ceilings, staining them black. At the cave's mouth, spears leaned against the stone points hardened by there. The walls themselves became canvases, paintings of bison horses, mammoths, etched and coloured in ochre and charcoal. These were not idle decorations. They were prayers, instructions, stories etched for survival. The tools of their daily lives were as ingenious as they were simple. Flint knives chipped with precision spears, tipped with stone ropes twisted from sinew clothing, layered with furs from fox, wolf, and reindeer. Nothing was wasted. Bones became awls and needles, fat burned as light tendons bound tools together. Every hunt was both feast and workshop, and yet survival was never guaranteed. Storms could last for days, burying camps under snow. Predators stalked the edges of firelight, drawn by the smell of blood and smoke. Crops could not be planted, so each season was a gamble, a race to find enough game to last the winter. But humans endured not by brute strength, but by cooperation. Families banded together, clans shared knowledge, and even strangers found reason to trade rather than fight. Alone they would have perished. Together they became something more. Imagine the silence of night in such a world. The wind rattles the hide walls of a bone hut, sparks drift upward from a dying fire, and in the distance a mammoth herd groans across the ice. Inside, wrapped in furs, a small community huddles close, breathing in rhythm, sharing warmth, sharing survival. This was humanity in the ice world, vulnerable, inventive, stubborn. A species that did not conquer the cold but learned to bend around it, weaving survival from bone, stone, and fire. And in doing so, they carved the first true steps toward culture, memory, and the long road to civilization. About 21,000 years ago, Earth stood at the height of its most recent Great Freeze, the last glacial maximum. Vast ice sheets gripped the planet, locking water into frozen prisons and sculpting continents into alien forms. To imagine this world, you must strip away familiar coastlines, redraw entire maps, and step into a landscape where the ordinary had been swallowed by white. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet sprawled across the land like a monster of frost stretching from the Arctic Circle down to what is now New York and Chicago. Its icy cliffs towered over valleys, crushing forests and rivers beneath kilometers of weight. Across the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian ice sheet smothered northern Europe, engulfing Scandinavia, Britain, and much of northern Russia. The Alps, the Pyrenees, the Rockies all bristled with glaciers pouring down their flanks, feeding rivers of ice that reached into once green valleys. So much water was locked away in ice that global sea levels fell by more than 120 meters. The world's coastlines retreated, exposing new lands where oceans now rule. The English Channel was not a channel at all, but a rolling plain. The North Sea was dry steppe, home to mammoths and reindeer. Between Siberia and Alaska, a vast grassland bridge called Beringia stretched hundreds of miles wide, a frozen corridor that linked continents and allowed humans, animals, and plants to wander into the Americas. The climate itself was unrecognizable. Dust storms raged across dry plains where rivers had shriveled. Rainfall patterns shifted, deserts expanded, and the winds blew stronger, scattering fine sediments into lush deposits that still mark landscapes today. In Africa, lakes shrank, and in Australia, arid zones widened, forcing both humans and animals to adapt or perish. The tropics were not spared. Mountain peaks in equatorial regions like the Andes and Kilimanjaro carried heavy glaciers, their summits crowned with ice, even as jungles thrived far below. To picture this world is to see a planet divided. At the poles and mid-latitude, ice ruled like a tyrant, silencing entire continents under its grip. At the margins, however, life clung stubbornly. Grasslands where herds thundered, coasts where humans gathered, shellfish caves where firelight flickered against walls painted with red ochre. The seas may have retreated, but for those who lived then, the exposed plains and bridges offered opportunities as well as dangers. It was a harsh, austere earth, one that pressed both animals and humans to their limits. Yet from its icy grip came migrations, innovations, and adaptations that shaped the course of history. The last glacial maximum was not simply a freeze, it was a crucible, a planetary reshaping that carved new maps, new challenges, and new beginnings. Stand for a moment in your mind on one of those frozen plains where the sea once flowed, but now lies silent. Behind you, glaciers loom like mountains of glass. Before you, the wind tears across an endless steppe dotted with herds and scattered fires of human camps. This was the world at its coldest, its harshest, and yet its most formative. Roughly 21,000 years ago, the Earth stood in the grip of its most recent deep freeze, the last glacial maximum. If you could look at a map, then you would scarcely recognize our planet. North America lay buried beneath the monstrous Laurentide ice sheet, its frozen weight stretching from the Arctic down across Canada into the northern United States, swallowing the land as far south as modern New York and Chicago. Across the Atlantic, Europe groaned beneath the Fennoscandian ice sheet, which smothered Scandinavia, Britain, and much of northern Russia under a seamless expanse of white. It was not just the high latitudes that bore this burden. Mountain ranges across the world, the Alps, the Andes, the Himalayas, the Rockies, sent glaciers spilling down their valleys like frozen rivers, gouging scars into rock that remain visible even now. The planet was a patchwork of ice and dust with habitable zones squeezed to the edges. Because so much of Earth's water was locked in ice, sea levels fell by more than 20 meters. Whole continents expanded outward. The English Channel was not yet a sea but a wind-swept plain connecting Britain to Europe. What is now the North Sea was grassland alive with mammoths, reindeer, and steppe bison. Across the Pacific Rim coastlines stretched for miles further than today, revealing fertile shelves that became temporary homelands. And then there was Beringia, the vast land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. It was no narrow path, but a continent-sized corridor hundreds of miles wide with rich grasslands and rivers. Herds of caribou and mammoths crossed it, and with them humans, small bands of hunter-gatherers who carried fire stories and stone tools into the Americas for the first time. The world's climate was stark and severe. Winds blew stronger, carrying dust from dried plains into vast blankets of loess that still cloak regions of China and Europe. Rainfall was scarce, rivers withered, and deserts expanded. Even the tropics bore the marks of ice mountains like Kilimanjaro, and the Andes carried glittering crowns of glaciers, reminders that no corner of the planet was untouched. To stand in that age would be to see a planet half familiar, half alien. The coast drawn back, the seas smaller, the continents larger, their faces reshaped by cold. Human life persisted in the margins along rivers that still flowed in caves where firelight painted ochre on stone on the plains that now lie drowned beneath modern seas. This was Earth at its coldest, its most unforgiving. Yet it was also a crucible, a test that honed the resilience of both humans and animals. From the vast silence of the glaciers to the windswept steppes of exposed seabeds, the last glacial maximum left behind not just scars in the land, but the deep memory of survival etched into our very bones. At the height of the last glacial maximum, oceans retreated, and what had once been seafloor became dry ground. Among these exposed landscapes, none was more consequential for human history than Beringia, a vast land bridge that stretched between Siberia and Alaska, opening a corridor from the old world into the new. It is tempting to imagine this bridge as a narrow, icy path, treacherous and barren. In truth, it was nothing of the sort. Beringia was immense, hundreds of miles wide, stretching like a continent in its own right. Far from desolation, it was a rich grassland plain dotted with rivers, lakes, and rolling hills. Herds of mammoths, steppe bison, reindeer, and horses grazed across its tundra steppe, drawing wolves, lions, and human hunters in their wake. For the people who crossed the journey was not a sprint, but a way of life. Families followed the herds, building temporary camps beside frozen rivers, crafting bone tools and fire-hardened spears, sewing warm clothes from hides stitched with sinew. Each crossing was measured in seasons, not weeks. Children were born on that land bridge, grew, and perhaps died there, never knowing they stood between two worlds. Imagine the scene, a caravan of humans and animals silhouetted against the horizon. Hunters scouting ahead through the biting wind, women carrying infants wrapped in fur, children chasing each other between reindeer hides stretched as makeshift tents. Smoke rises from a fire where marrow bones crack and meat roasts, while outside mammoths graze in the twilight. To those who lived it, Beringia was not a bridge, but a homeland, a place where life carried on as it always had, even as they crept toward a new continent. The eventual crossing into the Americas changed everything. From small bands moving cautiously through ice-free corridors, humanity spread across an entire hemisphere in a matter of millennia, reaching the tip of South America by around 14,000 years ago. The seeds of countless cultures, languages, and civilizations were sown in that migration, all beginning with the trek across a land that no longer exists. When the ice melted and seas rose, Beringia vanished beneath the waves, leaving only the Bering Strait to mark where the bridge once lay. Yet its legacy endures. Every indigenous nation of the Americas carries within it the echo of that journey, the memory of ancestors who braved the windswept steppe and stepped into a world no human had ever seen before. Beringia was more than a bridge of land. It was a bridge of destiny where courage and survival carried humanity into a new chapter of its story, written across the vast and varied landscapes of the Americas. Not all the power of the Ice Age lay in its stillness. Sometimes the ice moved not with the patience of centuries, but with the violence of hours. When glaciers dammed valleys and trapped immense lakes, the stage was set for cataclysm. And when those icy dams broke, the earth itself was rewritten in a single day. The most famous of these cataclysms was the Missoula floods unleashed at the end of the last ice age, in what is now the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Picture this: a wall of ice blocks the Clark Fork River in Montana, trapping a lake larger than some modern seas Lake Missoula. For centuries it swells, pressing against the ice dam. Then one day the pressure becomes too much. With a thunder like mountains breaking, the dam shatters. In an instant, half a cubic mile of water surges outward every second. Imagine standing on a ridge watching the horizon move an entire wall of water taller than skyscrapers, roaring faster than a galloping horse. Trees are uprooted boulders the size of houses roll like pebbles. Soil is scraped down to bedrock. The roar drowns everything, the ground shakes and the air fills with spray. For anyone who might have seen it, survival would mean one thing only: to run for higher ground if there was any left. The flood carves across Washington state, gouging vast channels, tearing valleys into scars now known as the Channeled Scablands. When the waters finally subside, the land is unrecognizable. Jagged cliffs loom where plains once lay. Pools, cataracts, and dry canyons gape like open wounds. And then over time the cycle repeats. The glacier creeps forward again, remakes the dam, refills the lake. And once more the world waits for the inevitable collapse. Geologists today still walk those scoured lands, marveling at ripple marks, taller than a person, at boulders carried hundreds of miles, at valleys too wide to be carved by any river. The only force strong enough was ice and the fury it unleashed when it failed. These floods remind us that glaciers are not only slow shapers of valleys, but also sudden violent sculptors of worlds. Their legacy is not just mountains polished smooth, but landscapes torn open in a single day. The Scablands stand as silent testimony, a place where time collapsed, where centuries of patience broke into hours of fury and where water set free by melting ice showed it could rival even the glaciers in its power to shape the Earth. Just as the world seemed to be thawing, just as humans and animals alike began to breathe easier under a warming sun, the Earth delivered a cruel reversal. Around 12 or 900 years ago, the planet plunged back into icy grip, a sudden sharp cold snap known as the Younger Dryas. Imagine living. Then glaciers had been retreating rivers, flowing freer plants, greening once barren plains. Hunters followed herds into new valleys, fish-filled meltwater lakes, and humans thought the long winter was ending. And then, without warning, the cold returned. Temperatures plummeted in a matter of decades, perhaps even years. Ice advanced again, winds sharpened, and ecosystems that had begun to bloom with life froze once more. For the people alive at that moment, it must have felt like the Earth had betrayed them hopeful spring turning to endless winter. The cause of this sudden chill remains one of the great debates of science. Some believe it was triggered by a comet or asteroid impact, its explosion scattering dust and soot into the sky, dimming sunlight and plunging the climate into cold. Others argue it was more subtle, a product of the ice itself. As massive ice sheets melted, torrents of fresh water spilled into the North Atlantic, disrupting the great conveyor belt of ocean currents that carries warmth across the globe. With circulation halted, heat could no longer flow northward, and Europe and North America froze anew. Whatever the trigger, the effect was devastating. Species already stressed by shifting climates faced collapse. Megafauna declined even faster. Human cultures had to retreat, abandoning lands they had only just begun to claim. It was a reminder that climate does not move smoothly or predictably. It can lurch, swing, and turn without mercy. The name itself, Younger Dryas, comes from a tiny flower, the Dryas octopetala, an Arctic blossom that suddenly spread across Europe again, carpeting the tundra where forests had started to grow. Its return was nature's marker, a sign that cold had seized the land once more. And then just as abruptly it ended. After about 200 years of renewed ice warmth surged back, glaciers retreated for good, and the Holocene, the age we now live in, began. But the memory of that false spring, that icy ambush, lingers in the geological record, and perhaps even in myth tales of sudden cold, of failed harvests, of near collapse. The Younger Dryas is more than an ancient chill. It is a warning carved into time. It shows us how delicate the balance is, how easily ocean's atmosphere and ice can shift the fate of life on Earth. And it whispers to us now, in our own age of climate uncertainty, the planet remembers how to change quickly, and it will not hesitate to do so again. When the Younger Dryas finally loosened its grip, the Earth exhaled. Glaciers retreated for the last time, rivers roared free, and climate softened into the warmer, more stable pattern we know as the Holocene. For humanity, this was not just a reprieve, it was the opening of a door. The ice had shaped us as hunters, wanderers, survivors. Now, with the cold in retreat, we would become something more. Across Eurasia and the Middle East grasslands gave way to forests, and wild grains sprouted in abundance. Herds of gazelle, aurochs, and sheep gathered near rivers, while humans, once forced to follow them endlessly, began to linger. The land was finally generous enough, the climate steady enough to allow something new settlement. In the Fertile Crescent, stretching from the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates to the Levant, small groups began to experiment. Seeds of wild wheat and barley were gathered, not just for eating but for planting. Goats and sheep, once prey, were penned, watched and bred. The rhythms of Ice Age migration slowly shifted into the cycles of ploughing, sowing and harvest. From this fragile experiment grew the Neolithic Revolution, the beginning of agriculture. The change was not instant, nor was it without cost. Farming tied people to the land, demanding labour, demanding planning. Diets narrowed. Diseases spread in villages where dozens of families now lived shoulder to shoulder. Yet the rewards were undeniable. Food surpluses meant children could survive in greater numbers. Communities could grow and knowledge could be stored and passed down, not only through memory but through symbols, carvings, and eventually writing. As the ice retreated, the stage widened for culture itself. In Anatolia, settlements like Çatalhöyük rose clusters of homes pressed together, painted with vibrant murals. In Mesopotamia, irrigation channels carved into fertile soil gave birth to cities. Farther east, rice paddies began to shape valleys of China. Farther west, olives and grapes would one day define Mediterranean shores. The retreat of ice was not just a climatic event, it was a cultural genesis. Humanity had walked through the crucible of glacial winters and emerged, change tempered by firelight in caves, by hunger on the tundra, by cooperation in bone shelters. When the warmth came, we were ready to step into a different kind of struggle to master the land, to build permanence, to create civilizations. Picture a field at dawn somewhere in the Fertile Crescent. Mist rises from a river, and a small band of humans, once nomads, bend low to sow seeds into soft earth. Behind them, children laugh, no longer fearing the endless march of glaciers. Before them lies a new chapter: villages, temples, empires. The world of ice had ended, and in its absence, humanity began to rise. Though the great continental ice sheets had long since retreated, the Earth did not settle into a gentle equilibrium. Even in the span of recorded history, cold has returned in sudden fits, mini ice ages that chilled crops, starved communities, and reshaped the course of civilizations. The first came in the 6th and 7th centuries, when a veil of volcanic ash dimmed the sun. Chronicles from Europe, the Middle East and Asia describe skies darkened for months, summers without warmth, harvests that failed. Recent studies suggest a series of massive eruptions, possibly in Iceland or Central America, spewed sulfur into the atmosphere, scattering sunlight and plunging the world into years of chill. The cold weakened empires. In Byzantium, famine and plague spread. In China, dynasties faltered under the weight of hunger. For those who lived then, it must have felt as if the heavens themselves had dimmed. But the most famous was the Little Ice Age, stretching from the 14th through the 19th centuries. It was not a single freeze, but a long series of cold intervals punctuated by short reprieves. In Europe, winters grew brutal. The Thames in London froze solid, thick enough to hold bustling frost fairs where tents markets and even puppet theatres sprang up on the river's icy back. In France, the Seine turned to glass, and canals in the Netherlands became highways for skaters gliding through bitter winds. Paintings of the era capture the cheer of these scenes, but beneath the laughter lay struggle. Cold brought famine. Crops failed again and again as growing seasons shortened. Vineyards withered. Grain spoiled in the fields. In the 17th century, entire regions of Europe faced starvation, and desperate populations grew restless. Plague and war spread in the weakened societies. Even far from Europe, the cold bit deep. In Japan, harsh winters coincided with famine and uprisings. In the Andes, advancing glaciers buried farmland. Across the world, people bent under the weight of climate they could not control. The causes of the Little Ice Age were many. Volcanic eruptions once again played their role, most famously the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, which led to the year without a summer in 1816. Ash blotted skies across the globe, crops failed from New England to China, and desperate populations turned to migration or revolt. At the same time, a lull in solar activity known as the Maunder Minimum cooled the planet further, its sunspots disappearing just as winters grew most severe, and yet humanity endured. From the cold came resilience, invention, and adaptation. Farmers experimented with hardier crops like potatoes. Societies adjusted diet, storage, and trade. Artists and composers captured the climate's mood. Vivaldi's Winter Brugels, Frozen Villages, all echoes of a world under frost. These mini ice ages remind us of a truth often forgotten: civilization rises and falls not only on politics or war, but on climate's whim. A single century of colder winters could starve thousands, topple dynasties, and spark migrations. The ice, even in smaller doses, has always been a hidden author of history. In the heart of the Little Ice Age winters, in Europe grew so bitter that even rivers surrendered to the freeze. The most iconic of these was the River Thames in London, which during the 17th and 18th centuries froze so solid in that it became a stage for a strange and fleeting festival of survival and joy, the Frost Fairs. Imagine walking onto the ice where boats once bobbed. Instead of water flowing under the London Bridge, you find rows of tents pitched directly on the frozen surface. Vendors sell roasted chestnuts, mulled ale, and spiced gingerbread. Blacksmiths hammer trinkets for curious onlookers, their forges glowing against the pale blue of the ice. Jugglers, dancers, and musicians entertain crowds muffled in furs. Children skate across the glassy surface, their laughter mingling with the cries of hawkers. For a few weeks, the frozen Thames became both market and carnival, a celebration of resilience in the face of unrelenting cold. Artists captured these surreal winters in vivid detail. Paintings show bonfires blazing on the ice rows of tents fluttering in the wind, and crowds thronging in merriment, as though the river had been transformed into a great public square. Printed souvenirs were even made on the ice itself, stalls offering to press your name into paper with ink so you could carry home proof printed upon the Thames, frozen over in the year of our Lord. But behind the cheer lay darker truths. The same cold that made fairs possible destroyed harvests. Year after year, crops withered in short, damp summers, and grain prices soared beyond what common families could afford. Famine followed, especially in rural regions where no fairs could soften the hunger. Malnutrition bred unrest. Food riots broke out, desperate crowds storming granaries or demanding bread from city leaders. Disease too thrived forward in weakened bodies. Plague and smallpox spread more easily when immune systems were ravaged by hunger. Even the fairs themselves carried risk. Beneath the stalls and laughter, the ice was never entirely trustworthy. Cracks sometimes opened suddenly, swallowing animals, stalls, and the unlucky souls who strayed too far. To stand on the frozen river was to gamble with nature's whim. Thus the frost fairs of the Thames remain a paradox, moments of joy and spectacle rising out of hardship, a carnival perched on the edge of desperation. They remind us that even in the bleakest winters, humans create warmth through song trade and laughter. Yet they also whisper the truth beneath the paintings, that beneath the frost and colour, people lived on the knife's edge of survival, and the ice was never just festive, it was fatal. The Little Ice Age was not confined to Europe's frozen rivers and fairs. Its chill wrapped around the globe, pressing empires, dynasties, and villages into hardship. In every corner of the world, the cold found its own way to leave scars. In China, the Ming dynasty staggered beneath the weight of repeated crop failures. Winters grew longer, summers shorter, rains unpredictable. Rice paddies in the south dried or froze at the wrong times, while wheat fields in the north yielded too little to feed the people. Famines swept across provinces, driving starving families to wander the roads in search of food. Banditry and rebellion followed in the wake of hunger. As the climate tightened its grip, political stability wavered. Some historians argue that the collapse of the Ming and the rise of the Qing dynasty cannot be separated from these icy years, a dynasty's fate rewritten by the weather itself. In Japan, too, the cold showed no mercy. The archipelago endured harsher winters, poor harvests, and waves of suffering. Rice, the lifeblood of society, withered in flooded or frozen fields. Famine struck again and again, and with famine came unrest. Villagers rose against local lords demanding relief, while some regions collapsed into violence. Stories from the era describe communities abandoning entire fields, surviving on bark acorns or whatever roots could be dug from frozen ground. The cold was not only a meteorological event, it was a social crisis shaking the foundations of feudal order. Farther south in the Andes of South America, the glaciers crept forward, swallowing farmland and villages that had clung to high valleys. Rivers fed by ice swelled in floods, then shrank in drought. The Andean people, long adapted to thin air and harsh conditions, now faced even greater extremes. Fields carved into the terraces at high altitudes froze more often while advancing ice devoured arable land. Communities prayed to the Apus, the mountain spirits, for mercy, offering sacrifices to stave off the hunger that accompanied advancing glaciers. Archaeological evidence shows that some valleys once used for agriculture were abandoned entirely during this cold surge. What unites these stories is not simply weather, but fragility. Across continents, human societies, whether mighty empires or scattered mountain villages, were at the mercy of a few degrees drop in temperature. Dynasties fell, rebellions rose, and families starved because the Earth's balance tilted slightly toward cold. The Little Ice Age was not just an inconvenience, it was a global stress test. It revealed how intimately human survival is tied to the rhythms of climate, how politics and power are never insulated from nature's breath. From Beijing's courts to the valleys of the Andes, the cold did not discriminate. It pressed down upon all, reshaping history beneath its frost. Even in the harshest winters, humanity did not merely endure, it created. The chill of the Little Ice Age seeped into the imagination, reshaping not just fields and politics, but art, music, and culture itself. Out of cold came beauty, a paradox as striking as the frost fairs on the Thames. Consider the music of Antonio Vivaldi, whose Winter from the Four Seasons captures the very essence of icy struggle. Violins shiver like teeth in the wind, melodies dart and crackle like frozen branches snapping under weight of snow. Listening to it is like stepping onto a frostbitten path. You can feel the bite of the air, the thrill of surviving it. His work was not merely performance. It was translation, an attempt to turn weather into sound to give voice to the season's merciless grip. In painting, the brush became another tool to capture the world transformed by ice. Artists such as Peter Bruegel the Elder turned winter landscapes into sprawling canvases of human life under snow. His villages are blanketed in white children skating on frozen ponds, hunters returning wearily with little game. There is play, yes, but also struggle. His snowy scenes are not decorative, they are chronicles of survival, reminders that even joy in winter was hard-earned. Literature too absorbed the cold. Writers and chroniclers described winters that seemed eternal rivers locked in glass fields barren. Some framed the cold as divine punishment, others as a test of human endurance. Poems and prayers alike bore the fingerprints of frost, turning weather into metaphor for resilience, fragility, and hope. Even popular festivals and traditions adapted. The frost fairs of London were not only commerce but culture birthplaces of printed souvenirs, ice-side plays, and the folk songs celebrating the strange, fleeting world where a river became a street. In Scandinavia and Russia, winter stories of spirits and frost demons grew richer, blending myth with the lived experience of long, punishing seasons. The climate itself became muse and adversary. Harsh cold forced people indoors, but in those confined spaces creativity bloomed. Fireside songs grew in complexity, winter stories deepened in meaning, and communities found solace in shared imagination when food was scarce and nights were long. Thus, the Little Ice Age shows us a deeper truth. Adversity shapes art. The frozen rivers inspired fairs, the empty fields inspired prayers, the bitter winds inspired symphonies. Out of struggle came works that still move us centuries later. When the world grew colder, human culture grew warmer, crafting beauty to fight back the silence of snow. For more than 2 million years, the Earth has swung like a pendulum between cold glacial periods and warmer interludes. These swings are not random, they are guided by the Milankovitch cycles, the slow rhythms of Earth's orbit and tilt. Over tens of thousands of years, small shifts in how our planet moves around the sun decide whether snow melts in summer or lingers, whether ice sheets retreat or advance. By this natural clockwork, we should expect another ice age to arrive eventually. The cycles suggest that left untouched Earth is not in a permanent warm spell. Glaciers would gather again, advancing from the poles until they swallowed Canada, Scandinavia, and much of northern Europe in walls of white. Seas would retreat by more than 100 meters, revealing ancient coasts, exposing forgotten lands. Humanity would be pressed toward the equator, our cities erased beneath the crush of ice. That has been the rhythm ice, then thaw, then ice again. But there is a new factor in the equation, us. For the first time in history, humans have altered the atmosphere on a planetary scale. Our burning of coal oil and gas has filled the air with carbon dioxide at concentrations unseen for hundreds of thousands of years. This greenhouse blanket traps heat, bending the old rhythm of Earth's climate. Some scientists believe that the levels of CO2 we've added are already enough to delay the next ice age by tens of thousands of years. The pendulum still swings, but its motion is muffled. It is a strange paradox. Our ancestors survived only because the ice retreated. Now our descendants may be spared another crushing glacial advance precisely because of our emissions. But the reprieve comes at a cost. Instead of cold, we face heat. Rising seas. Shifting storms and melting glaciers mark a different kind of upheaval, one of fire rather than frost. So will there be another ice age? Almost certainly in the distant future. The cycles that govern Earth's orbit are patient. They will outlast us, but when the next advance comes, it may not follow the familiar timeline. We have stretched the rules, delayed the rhythm, and introduced a new kind of instability. Standing at this moment in history, we occupy a narrow ledge between extremes. Behind us, the memory of mile-thick glaciers crushing continents. Ahead of us, the warming world we ourselves are driving. The question is not only whether another ice age will come, but whether we, like our ancestors, will find ways to adapt when the climate writes its next chapter. The truth is humbling. The Earth remembers how to freeze, and one day it will again. But until then, it is we, not the glaciers, who hold the balance of the planet's climate in our hands. Imagine it, the first whispers of a new ice age creeping across the world. At first, signs might seem subtle. Winters stretching longer summers, failing to thaw the ground. Fully storms carrying more snow than rain. Crops falter, harvests shrink, and rivers freeze earlier each year. But then the change accelerates. Year by year, glaciers inch outward from the north until walls of ice stand where forests once grew. Now picture New York City, its skyscrapers jutting like broken teeth above a frozen wasteland, the Hudson River sealed beneath meters of ice. In London, the Thames no longer hosts boats, but lies silent, entombed beneath a gleaming sheet of frost. Moscow, Berlin, and Toronto vanish entirely beneath the advance of continental glaciers. Highways, subways, airports, all buried in white silence, erased by time, as if they had never existed. The human cost would be staggering. As farmland disappears under permafrost, agriculture would collapse in northern latitudes. Wheat fields in Canada, Russia, and northern Europe would fail. Populations would be driven southward in massive migrations. Imagine millions pressing into the Mediterranean, into Central and South America, into Africa regions where soil still yields food and winters remain bearable. These migrations would not be gentle. Borders would strain nations, fracture, and wars over arable land and water would erupt. Energy grids would shatter under demand for heat. Coastal cities might at first find relief from the frozen seas, but as the glaciers lock away, water sea levels would drop, exposing barren shelves but drying vital ports. The balance of power in the world would shift overnight as regions near the equator, long overlooked, became the centers of survival and civilization. The psychological toll would be just as profound. Generations raised in temperate climates would face endless winters, their skies grey, their breath always visible in the air. Stories of green fields, summer heat, and open seas would become myths told to children by firelight, much as our own ancestors once told tales of warmth in caves during the last great freeze. It would not be the end of humanity, but it would be a transformation. Cities would fall, but new ones would rise where the sun still carried strength. Nations would collapse, but new cultures would form, forged by necessity. And perhaps just as our Ice Age ancestors did, we would adapt with invention, greenhouses glowing in the cold geothermal cities burrowed into volcanic earth, fleets of ships carrying food between the last fertile lands. If the ice returns, it will not ask our permission. It will not move on our timeline. It will come as it has always come, slow, then sudden, relentless. And in that frozen future, the question will not be whether civilization can survive, but what shape it will take when carved by the hand of ice once more. If the story of ice has taught us anything, it is that the climate is not a steady companion. It shifts, surges, and reverses, often with little warning. For all our models, for all our satellites, the Earth's climate remains a restless system, one whose rhythms we only partly understand. We like to imagine that the past few thousand years of relative stability, the Holocene, represents something normal, a baseline against which all else is measured. But in truth, this warmth and steadiness is the exception, not the rule. For millions of years, the planet has swung between brutal cold and suffocating heat, between frozen oceans and lush greenhouse worlds. Our normal is a narrow window in a vast gallery of extremes. Some argue that our rising greenhouse gases will delay the next ice age, locking us in a prolonged interglacial. Yet others warn that climate does not follow a single lever. Warming in one region can mean cooling in another. Ocean currents, atmospheric rivers, volcanic eruptions, solar cycles, each adds its own unpredictable twist. A shift in circulation could plunge Europe into icy winters even as global averages climb. A great eruption could darken skies, triggering harvest failures across the world, regardless of CO2 levels. This is the heart of climate's uncertainty. It is not a machine we can probe at, but a living system of feedbacks and chaos. A few degrees of temperature, a shift in rainfall, a wobble in orbit, each can cascade into transformations that redraw coastlines, reorder forests, or end civilizations. What is fragile is not the Earth, but us. The planet has thrived under ice and under fire, in atmospheres choked with methane, and in seas that boiled with life. It will continue reshaping itself long after we are gone. What hangs in the balance is the delicate web of stability that allows our crops to grow, our cities to stand, our billions to eat. The unsettling truth is this: we are living in a borrowed calm, a climate lull that feels permanent only because it has lasted our entire history. But stability is not guaranteed. The next great shift, whether toward heat, cold, drought, or flood, will come as it always has. And so the question is not whether the climate will change, but whether we will be flexible enough to change with it. The long shadow of the ice teaches us a story older than kings and empires. Survival belongs not to the strongest alone, but to the most adaptable. Time and again our ancestors faced winters that would have crushed the unprepared, yet they endured. How? Through fire, through cooperation, through ingenuity that turned fragility into resilience. Picture a small band of hunter-gatherers huddled at the mouth of a cave. Outside, the wind lashes snow across a frozen plain. Inside, flames crackle, shadows flicker, and the warmth of bodies pressed together pushes back the cold. Fire was more than light and heat. It was the beating heart of survival, the anchor around which human life was organized. It cooked food, kept predators at bay, and forged community. Around fire, language flourished, stories were told, and knowledge was passed on. But fire alone was not enough. Humans survived because they leaned on one another. Cooperation turned danger into possibility. One hunter's kill was shared across the group. Children were not the burden of parents alone, but of all. When the ice pressed hardest, survival depended on solidarity. Anthropologists call it allo-parenting, but in truth it was something simpler, an instinct to care beyond the self. Innovation too was forged in the crucible of cold. Need drove invention, sewing needles carved from bone-stitched hides into clothing warmer than fur alone. Mammoth bones became the frames of shelters covered with skins to create windproof homes. Snares and traps multiplied food supply. In places where resources were scarce, creativity became as essential as breath. The lessons endure. We are the children of people who faced down glaciers, who survived not by standing alone, but by bending, sharing, and imagining new tools. Every warm house, every loaf of bread, every circuit of electricity hums with that legacy. The ice was merciless, but it shaped us into problem solvers, storytellers, builders of community. And if another great shift comes, as history promises it will, those same qualities will decide whether we falter or thrive. The past whispers to us, adapt, cooperate, kindle your fire. These are not just survival strategies, but the very essence of what it means to be human. Ice has always been more than frozen water. It is sculptor and executioner, guardian and thief. It smooths mountains into gentle slopes and carves valleys into yawning scars. It buries civilizations without hesitation, and yet preserves a mammoth's last meal for 40,000 years. In its silence lies a paradox. Ice is both creator and destroyer, both cradle and coffin. When we step back and look at the sweep of time, the cycles of freeze and thaw resemble a heartbeat, the pulse of a planet alive in ways we barely understand. Each advance of ice erases, but also prepares. Each retreat reveals new landscapes, fertile soils, and opportunities for life to bloom. The Earth is not static, and perhaps it was never meant to be. It is a place of perpetual transformation where endings are simply beginnings in disguise. For us, the lesson is more intimate. Civilizations rise believing in permanence, temples of stone, cities of glass, towers of steel. Yet the ice reminds us that permanence is illusion. Rivers shift, forests vanish, glaciers grind mountains into dust. If the strongest peaks are fragile, what then of us? We are but guests here, our lifespans the flicker of a candle in a storm. And yet fragility is not failure. The very impermanence of our world is what gives it meaning. We value the harvest because winter strips the fields bare. We cherish warmth because cold steals it so easily. We love one another more fiercely because time, like the ice, is always advancing, always threatening to erase what we hold dear. Perhaps that is the deepest wisdom of the ice, that destruction and renewal are not enemies but companions. To live is to endure change. To endure change is to adapt. And to adapt is to honor the flow of time itself. In the mirror of the glaciers, we glimpse our own reflection, fleeting, fragile, yet luminous in its brevity. The ice is patient. We are not. But it is within that difference that our story unfolds, brief, vulnerable, and therefore precious. So now let the story of the ice soften into silence. You are not on a glacier, not in a cave with the wind screaming at the door. You are here in your own bed, safe and warm. The world outside may hum with traffic or whisper with night, but none of it can reach you now. The ice that once ground mountains to dust cannot touch you. You are protected, wrapped in softness, cocooned in the present. As you close your eyes, imagine the faint crackle of a fire, the same kind of fire that kept our ancestors alive through winters unthinkable. Picture their shadows on the walls of Tön, their voices telling stories into the dark. They survived not by strength alone, but by gathering close by, sharing food and warmth, by refusing to let the cold win. That same resilience flows in you. Every heartbeat is an echo of theirs. Every breath carries the rhythm of survival written into your bones. The ice has come and gone over and over, but life has always returned. So will you after every trial, every night, every season. You belong to a lineage that outlasted glaciers, storms, and ages of darkness. You belong to the earth itself, which has turned through cycles of fire and frost, carrying you to this moment of stillness. Now let the weight of blankets become your glacier, heavy and secure. Let the air around you be your cave, quiet and sheltering. The warmth of your own body is the fire, steady and unbreakable. You do not need to move, you do not need to fight, you only need to rest. Sleep is not surrender, it is survival, the same way our ancestors closed their eyes and trusted that dawn would come, and it always did. So let go gently into that long tradition. Feel yourself sinking into comfort deeper and deeper as if the earth itself were holding you. The ice may whisper of time and fragility, but tonight it whispers something simpler. You're safe, you are warm, you're home. Close your eyes, drift, dream. The story of the ice will wait, but for now it is time to rest. Thanks for being here. Hit that subscribe button and join us for the next chapters full of history and discovery.